I am Andrea, 34 years old, and for 28 years, my family treated me as nothing more than a biological ATM and a glorified servant. My parents raised my brother as a prince while I cooked his meals and cleaned his messes. They told me some children are born to serve. But at his lavish Hamptons wedding, his billionaire father-in-law saw my face made one single phone call, and a DNA test changed the course of all our lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the pain of a toxic family while secretly planning your escape. The morning of the wedding rehearsal began with the suffocating humidity, typical of late summer in the Hamptons, though. Inside the sprawling oceanfront estate, the air conditioning hummed with expensive efficiency. The house was a hive of chaotic activity. Caterers rushed past with silver trays, florists argued over the placement of white hydrangeas, and a team of high-end makeup artists had transformed the sunroom into a makeshift salon. I was standing near the doorway of the grand foyer holding a clipboard, with the vendor schedule managing the logistics just as I had managed every crisis in this family since I was a teenager. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the master suite flew open, and my younger brother Grant stormed out. At 28, Grant was the golden child entirely accustomed to having the world bend to his whims. He was dressed in a tailored Italian suit that cost more than most people made in a month, his face flushed with an ugly, petulant rage. He marched directly toward me, his heavy footsteps echoing sharply against the marble floor. Before I could even ask what was wrong, he whipped his hand forward and threw a piece of fabric directly into my face. The heavy silk struck my cheek with a stinging slap before fluttering to the floor at my feet. "You are an absolutely useless freeloader," Andrea Grant hissed, his voice echoing through the foyer and drawing the attention of the passing staff. "Do you see this? Do you have any idea how much this tie costs? It is a $500 custom silk piece, and you let a wrinkle settle right in the center of the knot. You had one job this morning, one simple job to prepare my wardrobe, and you failed. You are trying to embarrass me in front of my future wife." I looked down at the pristine piece of blue silk lying on the floor. There was a microscopic crease near the bottom, completely invisible unless you were searching for an excuse to be cruel. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to remind him that I had been awake since 4 in the morning, coordinating the caterers that he had forgotten to pay, but my mother Lydia swept into the hallway before I could speak. Lydia wore her wealth like a weapon. Her hair was perfectly styled, her jewelry understated but astronomically expensive. Instead of telling her grown son to calm down, she turned her icy glare entirely on me. She grabbed my upper arm, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin, and jerked me toward the discarded tie. "Pick it up," Lydia demanded, her tone laced with absolute disgust. "Pick it up right now and fix it. You are lucky we even allow you to be present in this house today. Grant is marrying into the Garrison family, one of the wealthiest oil dynasties in Texas. Everything must be flawless. Drop to your knees, plug in the steamer, and press that tie right here until it is perfect." I stared at her, feeling the eyes of the makeup artists and vendors burning into my back. They were whispering, pointing, watching a grown woman being degraded by her own family. "Mom, there is an ironing board in the laundry room," I said quietly, trying to preserve a shred of dignity. "I will take it there." Lydia slapped the back of my head, a sharp, humiliating strike. "You will do it here where I can watch you do it right," she snapped. "You owe this family your life, Andrea. Do not forget that. We took you in from the foster system. We put food in your mouth. You should be grateful to serve your brother. What else are you good for? We certainly did not get any return on investment from your education." The cruelty of her words was a familiar poison. She loved bringing up my education. She loved reminding me that I was a college dropout. What she conveniently left out of her public performance was the truth. I did not drop out of college at 20 because I lacked intelligence. I was forced to drop out. I was a junior with a full academic scholarship studying financial risk analysis when Grant managed to rack up $50,000 in illegal gambling debts during his study abroad trip in Europe. My parents had drained their liquid assets to cover his previous mistakes, so they forced me to leave school, take a full-time corporate job, and hand over every paycheck to save their precious son from a foreign prison. I sank to my knees on the cold marble floor. I pulled the small travel steamer from my supply bag and began smoothing the invisible wrinkle on the silk tie. Grant stood above me, crossing his arms with a smug, satisfied smirk. "That is exactly where you belong," Grant sneered, looking down at me as if I were an insect. "Do not think I will not throw you out on the street the second I am married. I am the one bringing real money into this family now." My father Howard walked into the foyer, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not reprimand his son. He simply looked at me kneeling on the floor and sighed with deep irritation. "Make sure she does not burn the silk," Lydia Howard said dismissively. "And Andrea, when you are finished playing the victim down there, I need you in my study. We have paperwork to finalize before the bride arrives. Remember your place today. You are a charity case, and today you earn your keep." I kept my head down, steam billowing softly around my hands. I did not argue. I did not cry. Crying was for victims, and I stopped being a victim 5 years ago. I simply pressed the silk, my face a mask of subservient compliance, while my mind calculated the exact hour their entire fake empire would burn to the ground. 10 minutes later, I stood in front of the heavy mahogany doors of Howard's private study. I knocked once and entered. The room smelled of expensive leather and imported cigars, a desperate attempt by my father to project a level of old money success that he did not actually possess. My family lived on credit, drowning in debt to maintain the illusion of high society, desperately banking on Grant's marriage to Felicity Garrison to save them from imminent bankruptcy. Howard was sitting behind his massive desk. He did not look up when I walked in. He simply slid a thick, legally binding document across the polished wood surface, followed by a heavy Mont Blanc pen. "Sign it," Howard ordered, his voice devoid of any parental warmth. I picked up the document. It was an irrevocable asset transfer agreement. Howard and Lydia knew I had been working remotely as a freelance data consultant. They believed I had managed to scrape together a meager savings account of perhaps $40,000. They had absolutely no idea that over the past decade, operating under strict non-disclosure agreements and corporate shells, I had become one of the most sought-after financial risk analysts on the East Coast. They thought they were demanding my life savings. They had no clue they were demanding pennies compared to the millions I actually controlled. "What is this for?" I asked, keeping my voice deliberately small and hesitant. Howard finally looked up, his eyes narrowing with contempt. "It is a wedding gift for your brother. Grant needs to show a certain level of personal liquidity before he signs the prenuptial agreement with the Garrisons. We are liquidating all available family assets to bolster his accounts. You are transferring your savings to him immediately." I placed the document back on the desk. "I am not giving Grant my savings, Dad. That money is for my future. I have paid for his mistakes enough." The reaction was instantaneous and violent. Howard surged upward from his leather chair, leaning across the desk. His hand shot out, striking me hard across the left side of my face. The slap echoed sharply in the quiet study. My head snapped to the side, a high-pitched ringing filling my ear as a hot, stinging pain radiated across my cheek. "You have no future." Howard spat, his face purple with rage. "You have no money. Everything you have belongs to this family. We bought you. We raised you. You are nothing but a stray dog we took pity on. You will sign that paper right now, or I will throw you out of this house with nothing but the clothes on your back. You will be homeless on the streets of New York by tonight, and I will make sure no company in this state ever hires a pathetic dropout like you." I slowly turned my head back to face him. I raised my hand and touched my burning cheek. I could taste a faint metallic tang of blood where my teeth had caught the inside of my lip. The old Andrea, the terrified girl who believed she was worthless, would have crumbled into tears and begged for forgiveness. But the woman standing in this study felt nothing but icy clarity. Fighting him right now would ruin the trap I had spent months building. I needed him to believe he was in absolute control. I needed him blind with arrogance. I picked up the heavy Mont Blanc pen. My hand trembled slightly, a performance of fear I had perfected over the years. I flipped to the final page of the document. I pressed the pen to the signature line, but instead of signing my legal name, I deliberately altered the strokes. I inverted the loop, skipped a crucial letter, and changed the angle of the final flourish. It was a signature completely inconsistent with my legal identification, an intentional discrepancy that would render the transfer document entirely void in any court of law or banking institution. I slid the paper back across the desk. Howard snatched it eagerly. He was so consumed by his own greed, so confident in his ability to break me, that he did not even look closely at the ink. He simply shoved the document into his briefcase and waved his hand in a gesture of utter dismissal. "Get out of my sight," Howard muttered, already turning his attention to his phone, "and clean yourself up. You look like a mess." I walked out of the study, quietly closing the mahogany doors behind me. The atmosphere in the house shifted dramatically an hour later, when a fleet of black SUVs pulled into the circular driveway. Felicity Garrison, the bride, had arrived with her entourage of wealthy bridesmaids. Felicity was a genuinely sweet girl, though deeply sheltered and completely unaware of the toxic reality of the family she was marrying into. She thought Grant was a successful entrepreneur. She had no idea his hedge fund was a hollow shell propped up by my parents remortgaging their home. The moment Felicity walked through the doors, Lydia and Howard transformed into the perfect loving future in-laws. They fawned over her, offering champagne and compliments, playing the role of aristocratic hosts flawlessly. I was standing near the staircase wearing a modest navy blue dress I had purchased specifically for the rehearsal dinner. I was supposed to be part of the background, keeping the schedule running. But Lydia spotted me. Her eyes darted from my dress to Felicity, and panic flashed across her face. She could not risk Felicity striking up a conversation with me. She could not risk the bride asking questions about Grant's adopted sister, a sister who might accidentally reveal the truth about their crushing debts. Lydia marched over to me, her fake smile plastered on for the guests, while her fingers dug ruthlessly into my ribs. She shoved me roughly into a narrow walk-in pantry off the main kitchen, pulling the door shut behind us. "Take that dress off," Lydia ordered in a harsh whisper. She reached up to a high shelf and pulled down a bundle of rough gray fabric. She shoved it hard against my chest. It was a traditional maid's uniform, complete with a stark white apron usually worn by the catering staff they hired for massive parties. "You are not mingling with the Garrisons," Lydia said, her eyes flashing with manic intensity. "You are not a guest at this wedding. You will put this uniform on, and you will serve the champagne. If anyone asks you, do not speak. You do not introduce yourself." I looked at the ugly gray fabric in my hands. "Mom, people know I live here. Felicity has seen me in passing. What are you going to tell her?" Lydia sneered, adjusting her diamond necklace. "I will tell her the truth. I will tell her you are a nobody. Now put the uniform on and get to work, or I will have security throw you out the back gate." 5 minutes later, I emerged from the pantry wearing the scratchy, ill-fitting gray uniform. I picked up a silver tray loaded with crystal champagne flutes and walked into the grand living room. The contrast between my drab attire and the designer gowns of the guests was glaring. I walked toward the bridal party to offer drinks. Felicity turned, reaching for a glass, and her eyes widened in mild confusion when she recognized my face. "Oh, hi," Felicity said kindly. "Andrea, right, Grant's sister. Why are you wearing that?" Before I could even open my mouth, Lydia appeared instantly, smoothly sliding between me and the bride. Lydia let out a high, sickeningly sweet laugh, waving her hand dismissively. "Oh, Felicity, darling, do not be silly," Lydia cooed loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "This is not Grant's sister. This is just our longtime maid. She is an old charity case we took pity on years ago. She is a bit mentally slow, bless her heart, so we let her wear the uniform and help out to give her a sense of purpose. Just ignore her, dear. She does not understand much anyway." Felicity's face fell into an expression of polite, mild disgust. She looked at me with deep pity, murmured a soft, "Oh, how sad," and immediately turned back to her wealthy friends, completely erasing my existence from her mind. I stood by the wall, holding the heavy silver tray. My face remained a mask of perfect, subservient calm. I did not drop the tray. I did not scream. I just stood there playing the role of the mentally deficient maid my mother had assigned me. But beneath the gray uniform, my heart beat with a steady, lethal rhythm. I carefully balanced the tray on one hand. With my free hand, I reached under the white apron and tapped the face of my Apple Watch. I opened a secure encrypted messaging app. I pulled up the contact for Silas, my private attorney and wealth manager, who operated my corporate accounts in the city. I typed a single precise message. Activate Phase 1. Lock all of Grant's loans. Send the default notices to the banks. I hit send. I looked across the room at Grant, who was laughing loudly and kissing Felicity's cheek, completely unaware that his financial life support had just been cut. I looked at Lydia and Howard, sipping their champagne blind to the reality that the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings on the very house they were standing in by Monday morning. I adjusted my grip on the silver tray, a slow, invisible smile curling the corners of my mouth. The countdown to their destruction had officially begun. The grand living room was a sea of clinking crystal and forced laughter. I navigated the crowded space, balancing the heavy silver tray with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime serving others. My gray maid uniform scratched against my skin, a physical reminder of my family's utter disdain. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the rehearsal dinner, illuminating the designer gowns and tailored tuxedos of the elite guests. I held my tray tightly, my face a carefully constructed mask of subservient emptiness. The physical discomfort was entirely secondary to the lethal rhythm of my own heartbeat. My phone was safely concealed beneath my apron, the digital kill switch for my family's entire existence already activated. I just needed to play my part for a few more hours. Grant and his groomsmen pushed their way out of the VIP wine room a few moments later. The heavy mahogany door swung shut behind them, cutting off the loud bass of the music inside. They moved through the crowd with the obnoxious confidence of men who believed they owned the world. Grant's face was flushed with expensive whiskey and unearned arrogance. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, his eyes darting around the room to ensure he was the center of attention. He spotted me standing near a marble pillar holding a fresh tray of champagne flutes. A malicious glint ignited in his eyes. He nudged the groomsman standing to his left and pointed his chin in my direction. I kept my gaze lowered, fixing my eyes on the polished marble floor. I knew exactly what was coming. Grant could never resist an opportunity to degrade me, especially when he had an audience to impress. He swaggered toward me, his entourage trailing closely behind like obedient dogs. As they approached, the tallest groomsman deliberately swerved out of his path. He thrust his leather-clad foot directly in front of my shins, just as I took a step forward. My ankle caught hard against his heavy shoe. The sudden impact threw my entire body off balance. I pitched forward, the heavy silver tray dipping precariously. Years of forced physical labor and serving this family kicked in, allowing me to shift my weight at the absolute last second. I braced my core, tightening my grip on the tray, and miraculously managed to keep the crystal flutes from toppling over. I caught myself breathing heavily, my knees shaking from the sudden jolt. A chorus of mocking laughter erupted from the groomsmen. "Watch your step, servant," the tall groomsman sneered, leaning in close so I could smell the stale alcohol on his breath. "You would not want to ruin the rich people's party." Grant stepped directly in front of me, blocking my path. He held a half-empty glass of dark red Cabernet. He looked at my face, searching for a reaction, searching for the tears he loved to provoke. But my expression remained entirely dead. I gave him absolutely nothing. My lack of reaction infuriated him. He needed a show. He needed to prove his dominance. "You are looking a little flushed from almost dropping my champagne," Grant said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding guests. "Let me help you cool down." With a swift, practiced motion, Grant flicked his wrist forward. The dark red wine flew from his crystal glass and splashed directly into my face. The cold liquid hit my eyes, blinding me instantly. The wine dripped down my nose, soaked into my eyelashes, and stained the stark white collar of my apron like fresh blood. I gasped involuntarily, the sudden shock of the cold alcohol burning my eyes. The groomsmen roared with laughter, clapping Grant on the shoulder as if he had just performed a brilliant comedic routine. Several guests nearby turned their heads, their conversations halting as they witnessed the groom humiliating a defenseless maid. I wiped my eyes with the back of my wrist, trying to clear my vision. Blinded and disoriented, I took a single unsteady step backward to put distance between myself and Grant. My heel caught the edge of a delicate glass side table positioned against the pillar. I felt the table wobble. I reached out to steady it, but my hands were slick with the spilled wine. A single crystal champagne flute left behind by a careless guest tipped over the edge. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, shattering crack that echoed like a gunshot through the sudden silence of the grand hall. The music seemed to stop. The laughter died in the throats of the groomsmen. Every eye in the room locked onto the shattered glass glittering around my cheap black shoes. What in the world is going on here? Lydia materialized out of the crowd like a venomous shadow. She pushed her way past the wealthy socialites, her face contorted into a mask of absolute fury. She saw the wine dripping from my face, the ruined white apron, and the shattered crystal on the floor. She did not ask what happened. She did not care that her son was standing there with an empty glass and a cruel smile. All she saw was her carefully orchestrated high society event being disrupted by the daughter she despised. "You clumsy, useless creature!" Lydia hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. Before I could even blink, Lydia closed the distance between us. She raised her hand and slapped me across the face with all the force she could muster. The impact snapped my head to the side. The sting radiated across my cheek, hot and furious, layering over the cold stickiness of the wine. Gasps rippled through the crowd of onlookers. Felicity's extended family stared in stunned horror as the mother of the groom physically assaulted a servant in the middle of a black tie rehearsal dinner. Lydia did not care who was watching. Her rage made her reckless. She leaned in her face, inches from mine, her voice a terrifying whisper, meant only for me. "You are a jinx!" Lydia spat, her eyes wide with manic hatred. "You are a walking curse on this family. You purposely try to ruin everything good that happens to Grant because you are a miserable, jealous failure. You bring bad luck to this house. Clean up this glass right now, get out of my sight, and do not let me see your cursed face for the rest of the night. If you ruin my son's wedding tomorrow, I swear I will make you wish you were dead." She turned on her heel, instantly transforming her face back into a warm, apologetic smile as she addressed the staring guests. "Please excuse the disruption, everyone. Good help is so hard to find these days. The music will resume shortly." Howard stepped forward from the crowd, shooting me a look of pure, unadulterated disgust, before placing his hand on Grant's shoulder and leading the laughing groom away toward the bar. I was left completely alone in the center of the room. The guests quickly averted their eyes, pretending I did not exist, eager to return to their conversations and their expensive hors d'oeuvres. I slowly sank to my knees on the cold marble floor. The wine dripped from my chin, staining the floor tiles. I reached out and began gathering the sharp, jagged pieces of shattered crystal. My hands moved mechanically. I picked up a large, triangular shard. My fingers slipped on the wet glass. The razor-sharp edge sliced directly into the fleshy palm of my right hand. I did not flinch. I did not gasp. I simply watched as a single thick drop of bright red blood welled up from the cut. The drop swelled heavy and dark before falling from my hand. It landed perfectly on the edge of the pristine white Persian rug that covered the center of the foyer. The blood bloomed outward, a permanent, undeniable stain against the flawless white fabric. I kept my head bowed, but my eyes slowly tracked upward. I watched Lydia laughing with a group of socialites pouring them fresh drinks. I watched Howard patting a business associate on the back. I watched Grant whispering into Felicity's ear, playing the role of the perfect, charming fiancé. They looked so happy. They looked so incredibly secure in their false empire. I pressed my thumb against the cut in my hand, feeling the sharp sting of physical pain anchor me to the present moment. For 28 years, a small, foolish part of my soul had desperately craved their validation. A pathetic fraction of my heart had always wondered if they could ever learn to love me. I had held on to a microscopic shred of pity for the people who had raised me, believing that beneath their cruelty, they were just flawed humans. As I stared at the drop of blood soaking into the carpet, that final shred of pity evaporated into thin air. It died, completely replaced by an absolute freezing vacuum of empathy. They were not my family. They were parasites. And tomorrow morning, I was going to exterminate them. The grandfather clock in the main hallway chimed midnight, signaling the end of the rehearsal dinner. The wealthy guests had long since departed in their chauffeured vehicles, leaving behind a battlefield of half-eaten hors d'oeuvres and empty champagne bottles. I was in the industrial kitchen of the estate, my hands plunged into a sink full of scalding soapy water. My cut palm throbbed with every movement, securely wrapped in a tight white bandage I had fashioned from a spare napkin. I did not stop scrubbing the delicate crystal glasses. Howard stormed through the swinging kitchen doors. He had discarded his tuxedo jacket, his tie hanging loosely around his neck. He surveyed the chaotic kitchen with a look of supreme irritation before his eyes locked onto me. "You are moving entirely too slow," Howard barked, marching over to the massive stainless steel island. The catering staff left an absolute disaster behind because they refused to stay past their contracted hours. "You will clean every single surface in this room. You will polish the remaining silverware, mop the marble floors, and take out all the trash. And do not even think about touching a single crumb of the leftover food. You do not eat until this house is completely spotless, even if it takes you until dawn." I kept my head down, my hands moving rhythmically in the soapy water. "Yes, sir," I replied, my voice a perfect imitation of a defeated servant. Howard scoffed, pouring himself a glass of expensive scotch from a bottle left on the counter. "Make sure it is flawless. Felicity and her family will be arriving early tomorrow for the wedding preparations. I will not have them seeing a filthy kitchen or a lazy maid." He turned and walked out, the heavy doors swinging shut behind him. I was left alone in the vast, brightly lit kitchen. My stomach tightened with hunger. I had not eaten since 6 in the morning, having spent the entire day managing the logistics of my abusers. The scent of leftover roasted duck and truffle potatoes lingered heavily in the air, a deliberate psychological torture designed by Howard to break my spirit. But my spirit was no longer something they could reach. I worked in silence for the next 2 hours. I polished the silver until it gleamed. I scrubbed the marble floors until my knees ached. I moved with calculated precision, conserving my energy for the battle that would erupt at sunrise. When the kitchen clock finally flashed 2 in the morning, I gathered the heavy black garbage bags from the commercial bins. I hoisted the bags over my shoulders and pushed through the back exit. The cool, salty air of the Hamptons night hit my face, providing instant relief from the stifling heat of the kitchen. I walked down the stone pathway toward the massive dumpsters, concealed behind a tall wooden fence at the edge of the property. The estate was dead silent. The security cameras on the back perimeter had convenient blind spots, a logistical flaw I had memorized years ago. I tossed the heavy bags into the dumpster. Stepping into the darkest corner of the enclosure, I reached beneath the collar of my scratchy gray uniform. I pulled out my secondary device, a heavily encrypted satellite phone that Howard and Lydia did not even know existed. The screen illuminated my face with a harsh blue glow. I opened my secure messaging application. Exactly on schedule, an incoming call notification flashed across the screen. The caller ID simply read, "Silas." I pressed the answer button and held the phone to my ear. "Good evening, boss," Silas said. His voice was crisp, professional, and entirely devoid of the mocking tone I had endured all night. "Give me the status report, Silas," I replied, my voice dropping its subservient pitch and returning to its natural commanding cadence. "Is the net secure?" "The net is completely secured," Silas confirmed, the sound of a keyboard clacking rapidly in the background. "I executed Phase 1 exactly as you instructed. We deployed the financial blockers across all of Grant's known accounts. Every single credit line associated with his name, his shell companies, and his fraudulent hedge fund has been frozen by the issuing banks." "What about the offshore accounts?" I asked, watching the dark windows of the mansion. "Locked tight," Silas replied smoothly. "The audio file you uploaded from the wine room was the final nail in the coffin." I forwarded the relevant financial admissions to our contacts at the federal regulatory agencies. They flagged his offshore movements for suspected money laundering and illegal gambling debts. His assets are currently impounded pending a full federal investigation. He has exactly zero liquidity. I smiled, the cool night breeze lifting the hair off my neck. I needed him completely paralyzed by tomorrow morning. What is the immediate impact schedule? Silas chuckled softly, a sound of pure financial predation. The timing is going to be spectacular. Grant scheduled all the final vendor payments for the wedding to be automatically drafted at 7 in the morning. That includes the $50,000 balance for the floral arrangements, the catering staff wages, and the luxury vehicle rentals for the groomsmen. Every single one of those transactions will hit a hard decline. When he attempts to call his bank to authorize the payments, he will be redirected to their fraud department. Excellent work, Silas! I leaned against the wooden fence, feeling the adrenaline hum through my tired muscles. And my parents, Howard and Lydia, are officially standing on quicksand, Silas reported. Their mortgage default notices have been processed. I purchased their debt portfolio through one of our subsidiary firms yesterday afternoon. The mansion they are currently sleeping in legally belongs to your holding company. You have the absolute authority to evict them at your discretion. Do not initiate the eviction yet, I commanded. I want them to experience the wedding ceremony first. I want them standing in front of the billionaire family they so desperately tried to impress when the walls cave in. Prepare the final acquisition documents and have them ready for my signature. I want the complete destruction of their financial identity finalized by noon tomorrow. Understood. We are on standby. Get some rest, boss. Tomorrow is going to be a historic day. I ended the call and slipped the encrypted phone back into my hidden pocket. I stood in the darkness for a moment longer, looking up at the sprawling multi-million-dollar estate. My family was sleeping soundly inside, dreaming of the massive fortune they believed they were about to secure through Grant's marriage. They were completely oblivious to the fact that their entire reality had just been dismantled stroke by stroke by the very woman they had forced to scrub their floors. I took a deep breath of the ocean air. The hunger in my stomach was gone, replaced by a profound, sustaining sense of power. I turned and walked back toward the kitchen door, ready to play the obedient servant for just a few more hours. The trap was sprung. The financial guillotine was primed. Tomorrow the fake prince would wake up as a pauper and the servant would finally claim her throne. The morning sun breached the horizon, painting the Hamptons estate in a brilliant, deceptive gold. The air was thick with the frantic energy of wedding preparations, but the usual pre-ceremony excitement was overshadowed by a distinct tension. Grant was pacing near the front windows, his face pale and slick with sweat. I watched him from the kitchen threshold, polishing the same silver tray from the night before. His phone was glued to his ear. I knew exactly why. Every single vendor payment he had scheduled for the morning had bounced. The exclusive floral designer, the premium catering service, the luxury vehicle rentals for his groomsmen, all of them were demanding their cash, and his frozen accounts were yielding absolutely nothing. He was trapped in a financial chokehold, and the walls were closing in fast. Before Grant could properly panic, a deafening roar shattered the morning quiet. The rhythmic, heavy thud of helicopter rotor blades shook the glass panes of the grand foyer. The Garrison patriarch had arrived. Lawrence Garrison did not just enter a room, he commanded the very atmosphere within it. He stepped off the private helicopter onto the manicured back lawn, flanked by a team of stone-faced private security personnel. Lawrence was a man carved from Texas oil money and ruthless corporate acquisitions. He wore a sharp, charcoal gray suit that spoke of effortless power. His silver hair was swept back, and his piercing dark eyes scanned the property with the calculating gaze of an apex predator assessing its prey. Howard and Lydia scrambled out of the house like desperate peasants rushing to greet a king. They practically tripped over their own feet in their haste to reach the helipad. Howard plastered on a sickeningly wide smile, extending both hands to greet the billionaire. Lydia smoothed down her designer dress, her face contorted into a mask of pure sycophancy. Grant quickly shoved his useless phone into his pocket, forcing a confident grin as he rushed to join his parents. "Oh, Mr. Garrison, what an absolute honor. Lydia gushed, her voice pitching an octave higher than normal. "We are so thrilled you could join us early. Felicity is getting ready upstairs. The estate is entirely at your disposal." Lawrence gave them a tight, perfunctory nod. He did not smile. He simply walked past them toward the main house, his security detail trailing closely behind. Howard and Lydia scurried after him, entirely oblivious to his blatant disregard for their flattery. They were too blinded by the dollar signs attached to his name to notice they were being treated like gnats. I retreated into the kitchen, placing the silver tray on the stainless steel counter. The heavy swinging doors burst open a second later. Lydia marched in, her eyes wide with frantic manic energy. She grabbed my arm, her long nails digging into the bruise she had left the night before. "Listen to me, you useless stray," Lydia hissed, her breath hot against my face. "Lawrence Garrison is sitting in the main drawing room. He is the most powerful man in the country. He expects absolute perfection. You are going to take the vintage Bordeaux from the reserve cellar. You will pour it into the finest crystal glasses we own, and you will serve it to him." I kept my face perfectly blank. "Why me?" I asked quietly. "You have professional caterers arriving in 10 minutes. "Because I need someone disposable to test his mood," Lydia snapped, her cruelty completely unmasked. "If the wine is not allowed to breathe properly, or if he is in a foul temper, he will direct his anger at the servant. I will not have my hired staff offending him, and I certainly will not risk Grant looking foolish. You are a nobody. You are a shield. You will go out there, serve the wine, keep your mouth shut, and disappear into the wallpaper. Do you understand me?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am," I replied, pouring the deep red wine into the crystal glasses. I picked up the heavy silver tray. I walked out of the kitchen, my posture rigid, my gray maid uniform stark against the opulent surroundings of the drawing room. Lawrence Garrison was seated in a high-backed leather armchair, his posture commanding and relaxed. Howard stood awkwardly by the fireplace, desperate to make small talk. Grant was hovering near the bar, looking increasingly panicked as his phone buzzed relentlessly in his pocket. Silas was doing his job perfectly. The banks were calling Grant to inform him of the federal holds on his accounts. I stepped softly across the Persian rug, approaching the billionaire. As I drew closer, I felt a strange, inexplicable chill run down my spine. Lawrence Garrison possessed an intense magnetic energy. His sharp eyes flicked away from Howard's rambling speech and landed directly on me. He did not look at me with the disdain my family did. He looked at me with clinical observation. I lowered my gaze, playing the part of the invisible servant, and extended my arms to offer the tray to the billionaire. Just as Lawrence reached out to take the crystal glass, Lydia appeared from my blind spot. She had been watching from the hallway, eager to assert her dominance and ensure I remained sufficiently humiliated in front of her wealthy guest. She stepped forward with alarming speed, pretending to rush to Howard's side. As she passed directly behind me, she drove her sharp elbow hard into my right shoulder blade. The impact was deliberate and forceful. My upper body jerked forward, the heavy silver tray tilted violently. The expensive vintage wine sloshed over the rim of the crystal glass, spilling dark red droplets onto the pristine tray and splashing directly onto the polished toe of Lawrence Garrison's custom Italian leather shoe. I froze, bracing the tray with everything I had to keep the remaining glasses from shattering onto the floor. Lydia let out an exaggerated theatrical gasp. She immediately grabbed my arm, digging her nails in so deeply I almost winced. "You clumsy, incompetent idiot!" Lydia shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "I am so terribly sorry, Mr. Garrison. This girl is completely useless. I told the agency not to send anyone so incompetent, but she is a charity case we took pity on. Please forgive her stupidity." She snatched a linen napkin from the table and practically shoved me to the floor. "Get down on your hands and knees and wipe his shoe. Right now, you clumsy fool," Lydia ordered, her eyes burning with malicious triumph. "Show some respect." I knelt on the floor, the rough carpet scraping my bare knees. I kept my face blank, holding the linen napkin. I reached out toward the billionaire's shoe, maintaining my submissive facade, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. My fingers grasped the linen napkin, pressing it gently against the polished Italian leather of Lawrence Garrison's shoe. As I leaned forward, the hurried, frantic motion caused the tight bun at the nape of my neck to loosen. A heavy lock of dark hair slipped from its pins, cascading over my shoulder and falling forward to completely expose the skin behind my right ear. Right there, etched into my flesh since the day I was born, sat a distinct silver scar shaped exactly like the letter V. I had never thought much of it, viewing it merely as a unique birthmark that Lydia had always forced me to cover up with heavy concealer or tight, restrictive hairstyles. She always claimed it was an ugly defect that offended her aesthetic sensibilities. Today, in the violent rush of being shoved into the scratching maid uniform, I had not bothered to hide it. Above me, the steady rhythmic breathing of the billionaire abruptly stopped. A sharp, ragged intake of air broke the silence of the grand drawing room. I kept my head down still, dabbing at the spilled wine, assuming he was merely disgusted by the mess I had made. But then the heavy crystal champagne flute slipped entirely from Lawrence Garrison's grasp. It hit the marble floor beside my knee with an explosive crash. Crystal shards exploded outward, raining down on the carpet and my bare legs. Lydia shrieked again, immediately launching into another desperate volley of apologies. She began screaming about having me fired, promising to banish me from the property, but Lawrence did not even look at her. He did not look at the ruined vintage wine or the shattered crystal. He dropped to his knees right there on the wine-soaked carpet, completely ignoring the damage to his immaculate, expensive suit. Before I could process what was happening, his large, weathered hands shot out and clamped around my wrists. His grip was like a steel vise, trembling with a violent, uncontainable energy. I flinched, startled by the sudden physical contact, and finally looked up into his face. The ruthless, untouchable oil tycoon was gone. The man staring back at me looked as though he had just seen a ghost rise from the grave. His dark, calculating eyes were wide, completely dilated with shock, and glistening with sudden, unshed tears. His breathing was shallow and erratic. He stared at the side of my neck, his gaze locked onto the V-shaped mark with an intensity that bordered on sheer madness. "What is your name?" Lawrence demanded. His voice was a harsh, gravelly whisper that barely sounded human. It was stripped of all its corporate command, leaving behind only raw, naked desperation. I froze, the silver tray slipping from my other hand. The sheer emotional weight radiating from him paralyzed my carefully constructed plans. "I am Andrea, sir," I replied quietly, maintaining the meek persona out of pure habit. "No." Lawrence shook his head frantically, his fingers tightening around my wrists so hard it bruised my skin. "No, that is not possible. Tell me the truth. When were you born? Give me the exact date. What year? Answer me right now." The urgency in his tone sent a shockwave through the room. The sycophantic chatter of the wealthy guests died instantly. Grant stepped back, his arrogant smirk melting into utter bewildered confusion. Lydia stood frozen, her mouth hanging open, unable to comprehend why the most powerful man in the room was kneeling on the floor with the family scapegoat. But it was Howard's reaction that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. I caught a glimpse of my father standing near the massive stone fireplace. All the color had instantly drained from his face. His skin turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray. His eyes bulged with a terror so profound, so absolute, that he looked like a man staring directly into the barrel of a loaded gun. The smug, controlling patriarch who had slapped me just an hour ago was visibly trembling. His hands were shaking so violently, he had to grip the wooden mantle just to remain standing. He recognized the danger. He knew exactly what that scar meant, and he knew that Lawrence Garrison recognized it too. I opened my mouth to answer the billionaire. "I was born on October 14th. Before I could finish the sentence, Howard lunged across the room. He moved with a panicked, desperate speed I had never seen him use. He practically threw himself between me and Lawrence Garrison. His hands clawed into my shoulders, his fingers digging brutally into my collarbone as he violently yanked me backward, tearing me out of the billionaire's desperate grip. "Get away from him, you clumsy fool!" Howard roared, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. He hauled me to my feet, positioning his body like a human shield between me and Lawrence. Howard was panting, his chest heaving, sweat beating rapidly on his forehead. He forced a laugh, a loud, hysterical sound that echoed awkwardly in the tense silence of the drawing room. I am so incredibly sorry, Mr. Garrison. Howard stammered his words, spilling out in a frantic, desperate rush. Please do not pay any attention to her. As my wife said, she is completely unwell. She is a charity case, an orphan we took in from the local parish. She is severely confused. Lawrence slowly rose to his feet, ignoring the shards of glass crunching beneath his leather shoes. He did not take his eyes off me. He looked past Howard's trembling shoulder, his gaze burning with a terrifying, piercing intensity. When was she born? Lawrence repeated, his voice dropping an octave, taking on a lethal, dangerous edge. I asked a very simple question, Howard. Answer it. Howard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly against his collar. 1994. Howard blurted out instantly. He spoke too fast, his tone dripping with extreme defensiveness. She was born in the winter of 1994, sir. She is 30 years old, just a tragic, mentally deficient orphan with no family history whatsoever. We do not even know where she came from. I stared at Howard's rigid back, my mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. 1994. Howard had just lied directly to the face of a billionaire. I was born in 1992. I was exactly 34 years old. Why would he deliberately alter my age by exactly 2 years? Why was he sweating through his custom suit? Why was he looking at Lawrence Garrison with the pure naked fear of a man whose darkest, most horrific crime had just been dragged into the light of day? Lydia finally snapped out of her paralyzed shock. She rushed forward, grabbing my arm with a crushing, frantic grip. She dragged me backward toward the heavy kitchen doors. Get to the back of the house right now, Lydia hissed into my ear, her voice shaking with an anxiety that perfectly mirrored her husband's terror. Do not speak to anyone. Do not stop walking until you are out of sight. I did not resist. I allowed her to drag me out of the drawing room, but my eyes remained locked on Lawrence Garrison until the heavy wooden doors swung shut, cutting off my view. The billionaire was not looking at Howard. He was not looking at the spilled wine. He was staring at the empty space where I had just been standing, his expression a terrifying, volatile mix of sudden realization, agonizing grief, and a rising volcanic fury. The pieces of the puzzle were violently snapping together in my mind. The forced isolation, the constant verbal abuse. The way they had always treated me not just as a heavy burden, but as a stolen asset they desperately needed to keep hidden from the world. My family had not just been cruel to me for 28 years. They were hiding a massive criminal secret. And the key to their absolute inevitable destruction was not just the financial trap I had already set in motion. It was the very blood running through my own veins. Lydia did not loosen her grip until we were completely out of sight from the grand drawing room. She dragged me violently down the long, opulent corridor, her fingernails digging so deeply into my flesh that I could feel the skin breaking. We rounded the corner toward the back service hallway. Howard was right behind us, his heavy footsteps thudding against the hardwood floor. He was breathing like a cornered animal, taking short, ragged gasps of pure panic. "Move faster!" Howard hissed, shoving me roughly between my shoulder blades to propel me forward. "Get her downstairs right now!" They dragged me toward the basement access door. The polished aesthetic of the mansion vanished, replaced by rough concrete steps leading down into the subterranean storage levels. Lydia pushed me hard. I stumbled down the stairs, catching myself on the cold iron railing to keep from pitching forward into the darkness. Howard descended right behind me, his massive hands grabbing the back of my maid uniform. He hauled me toward the windowless wine cellar at the very back of the basement. The cellar was a heavy vault-like room lined with expensive oak racks and thick stone walls. It was designed to keep out light and regulate temperature. It was the perfect, inescapable cage. Howard threw me inside with a violent shove. I hit the stone floor hard, scraping my hands against the chilled concrete. Before I could even push myself up, the heavy solid oak door slammed shut. The mechanical clank of the exterior deadbolt sliding into place echoed like a gunshot in the pitch-black room. I was completely trapped in the darkness. The air was thick, smelling of aged cork and damp earth. I did not scream. I did not beat my fists against the heavy wood. I simply stood up, brushed the dirt from my uniform, and walked silently toward the door. I pressed my ear flat against the cold oak surface. Outside the cellar, Howard and Lydia had completely lost their minds. The polite aristocratic facade they had maintained for decades evaporated, replaced by the vicious, frantic arguing of two desperate criminals turning on each other. "Are you out of your mind?" Lydia shrieked, her voice muffled but entirely legible through the heavy wood. "Why did you lie about her age?" 1994. Lawrence is not an idiot, Howard. He saw the scar. He looked right at her neck and saw the mark. "Keep your voice down," Howard snarled back. "What did you want me to do? Tell the billionaire oil tycoon that the maid scrubbing his shoes was born in 1992, the exact same year his infant daughter was abducted. I had to say something to throw him off the scent. I had to create a discrepancy." "It is not going to work!" Lydia sobbed, her voice cracking with hysterical terror. "You saw his face. He knows. He recognized the shape of that scar instantly. I told you we should have had it surgically removed when she was a toddler. I told you it was a risk keeping her alive. If we had taken her to a surgeon, they would have asked questions." Howard snapped, pacing the concrete floor outside. "A unique birthmark like that? It was broadcast on every national news station for months. We could not risk bringing her to a hospital. We had to keep her hidden in plain sight." I pressed my hand against my mouth. The darkness around me seemed to spin, but my mind was sharpening into a deadly, crystalline focus. "We should have left her at an orphanage," Lydia cried, her pacing matching his. "We had the money. We secured the drop. We should have dumped her in another state and walked away. And leave a DNA trail for the FBI to eventually find," Howard countered viciously. "No. Keeping her under our roof was the only way to ensure she never submitted to a genetic test. We controlled her environment. We controlled her identity. It was the perfect cover. Nobody looks for a missing billionaire heiress in the guise of a beaten-down, uneducated servant working for a respectable family." Through the thick oak door, the horrific, monstrous truth of my entire existence unraveled piece by piece. I was not an unwanted burden. I was not a charity case handed over by a broken foster system. I was the stolen daughter of Lawrence Garrison. 32 years ago, my parents had not graciously adopted me. They had abducted me. "Do you think the statute of limitations matters to a man like Lawrence Garrison?" Lydia wailed, her voice echoing off the basement walls. "I worked in that maternity ward, Howard. I was the nurse aide on duty the night she was taken. If he connects the dots, if his security team pulls the hospital employment records from the Midwest in 1992, we are dead. He will not just send us to federal prison, he will destroy us." "He is not going to find out," Howard said, though his voice shook with undeniable fear. "We have to keep her locked down here until the wedding is over. Once Grant officially marries Felicity, we take the payout from the offshore accounts and we vanish. We leave the country tonight. Grant will have the Garrison name protecting him, and we will be safely out of jurisdiction." "What about the ransom money?" Lydia asked, her voice dropping to a harsh, greedy whisper. "The funds we used to build this life. If Lawrence looks into our financial history, he will see the massive influx of cash right after the kidnapping." "The ransom money is gone," Howard growled. "We spent every last cent of those $10 million raising Grant to be a prince. We bought the businesses, we bought the cars, we bought the private school tuitions. Grant is marrying into the Garrison empire precisely because we used Lawrence Garrison's own money to buy our son a seat at the table. It was a flawless investment. We just need to hold the line for 12 more hours." My breath caught in my throat. The sheer, unfathomable evil of their plan struck me with the force of a physical blow. They had kidnapped an infant. They had extorted $10 million from a grieving father. They had used my ransom money to fund their fraudulent, luxurious lifestyle and to raise their biological son Grant as a spoiled, entitled prince. Meanwhile, they had kept me locked away, abusing me, starving me, and forcing me to act as a slave to the very boy whose lavish life was entirely funded by my own kidnapping. They had tortured the rightful heiress to serve the imposter. And now the ultimate sickening irony was unfolding upstairs. Grant was about to marry Felicity. He was about to marry my biological sister. He was using the wealth stolen from my family to buy his way into my family. I stepped back from the heavy oak door. The damp, cold air of the wine cellar washed over me, but I did not feel a single shiver. The crushing weight of 28 years of subjugation of believing I was inherently worthless evaporated entirely. It was replaced by a towering, magnificent inferno of righteous vengeance. I reached into the hidden pocket beneath my gray apron. I bypassed the standard phone and pulled out the encrypted satellite device. The screen illuminated the pitch-black room with a harsh, brilliant blue light. I did not have a signal connection to the main cellular towers down in the basement, but this device utilized low-orbit satellite arrays. It possessed a flawless, unbreakable connection. I opened my secure messaging application. The countdown to their absolute destruction was no longer just about financial ruin. This was an execution. Silas. I typed, my thumbs moving with lethal precision over the digital keyboard. Escalate the timeline. Cancel the holds. Move immediately to total asset seizure. Do not wait for the wedding ceremony. Drain every account connected to Howard, Lydia, and Grant to absolute zero. I paused, my eyes tracing the rough stone walls of my dark cage. I typed the final devastating command. Then ran a high-priority background check on hospital employment records in the Midwest for the year 1992. Cross-reference Lydia and Howard against the Lawrence Garrison infant abduction case. Prepare to forward the findings directly to Lawrence Garrison's head of security. The game is over. I pressed send. The message encrypted and vanished into the digital ether. I stood in the dark entirely alone, but I had never felt more powerful. Howard and Lydia thought they had locked a helpless servant in a cage to silence her. They had no idea they had just locked themselves in a tomb with the very monster that was going to tear their fake empire limb from limb. Lawrence Garrison stepped out of the heavy mahogany doors of the Hamptons estate, the crisp morning air doing nothing to cool the molten fury raging inside him. He walked with a terrifying, absolute stillness. His security detail immediately fell into formation around him, sensing the volatile, dangerous shift in his demeanor. He did not look back at the mansion. He did not acknowledge the valets or the frantic preparations for his daughter's wedding occurring on the lawns. He walked straight toward his private helicopter, the rhythmic thumping of the rotors echoing the violent pounding in his own chest. Bennett, his director of global security, matched his pace perfectly. Bennett was a former intelligence operative, a man whose entire career was built on reading the microscopic shifts in his employer's behavior. He knew Lawrence Garrison better than anyone. He knew the billionaire was rarely rattled. But right now, Lawrence looked like a man who had just touched a live electrical wire. Sir Bennett said, his voice low, cutting through the noise of the helicopter. "You left the drawing room abruptly. Is there a security concern with the venue?" Lawrence stopped just short of the helicopter's boarding steps. He turned to face Bennett. The billionaire's eyes were completely devoid of their usual corporate calculation. They were wide, frantic, and burning with a terrifying, desperate vulnerability. Bennett Lawrence rasped, his voice barely audible over the engine roar. "Did you see the maid? The one who spilled the wine?" Bennett nodded, his expression remaining perfectly neutral. "Yes, sir. Howard's staff. She appeared to trip." Lawrence reached out and grabbed Bennett by the lapels of his suit jacket. It was an unprecedented breach of protocol. The billionaire's hands were shaking violently. He pulled the massive security director close, his breath hot against Bennett's face. 32 years! Bennett Lawrence whispered, the words ripping from his throat like torn metal. 32 years, I have looked at every face, every crowd, every missing child report. I know the shape of that scar in my sleep. I see it every time I close my eyes. I drew it for the sketch artists 1,000 times. Bennett's military posture stiffened. The blood drained instantly from his face. "Sir, are you saying—" Lawrence released his grip on the security director. He took a ragged, shuddering breath, trying to force oxygen into his suffocating lungs. The scar behind her right ear. It is a perfect, distinct V-shape. It is a congenital dermal deformity. It is genetically identical to the one documented in my daughter's pediatric file. The implication hit Bennett like a physical blow. The security director had been with the Garrison family for decades. He knew the history. He knew about the 1992 kidnapping. The ransom paid in full, the dead drops that went cold, the agonizing decades-long search that had yielded nothing but ghosts and false leads. Lawrence's eyes hardened, the desperation morphing into a cold, terrifying clarity. Howard lied to me, Bennett. He told me she was born in 1994. He panicked. He shoved himself between me and that girl like he was protecting a nuclear launch code. He was sweating, Bennett. The man looked like he was about to face a firing squad. Bennett's tactical mind immediately snapped into gear. He pulled out a secure encrypted communication device from his interior pocket. "What are your orders, sir?" Lawrence leaned in close, his voice dropping to a lethal commanding whisper. "You do not leave this property. You do not let Howard or his wife out of your sight. You go back into that drawing room right now." When she dropped the tray, she cut her hand picking up the broken crystal. She bled on the carpet. "You find that glass. You find the blood. You secure the sample." Bennett nodded sharply. "Understood. And the analysis?" Lawrence's jaw clenched, his eyes burning with a furious, unyielding fire. "You contact our private medical facility in Manhattan. You wake up the chief geneticist. Tell him to prep the sequencer. You fly the sample there yourself via the secondary chopper. I want a full expedited DNA panel run against my personal genetic profile. I want the results before the wedding ceremony begins tomorrow morning." "Consider it done, sir," Bennett replied, already turning back toward the mansion. And Bennett Lawrence called out, stopping the security director in his tracks. The billionaire's voice was deathly quiet, carrying the weight of a 30-year nightmare finally coming to an end. "Open the sealed files. Access the original FBI kidnapping dossier from the Midwest Hospital. Pull every single employee record from that maternity ward in 1992. Cross-reference every nurse, every doctor, every janitor, and every aide against Howard and Lydia's background checks." Bennett's eyes narrowed as the pieces began to connect. "You suspect they were involved in the initial abduction." Lawrence looked back at the sprawling, opulent mansion. Howard and Lydia had built this fake empire on a mountain of debt, desperately clinging to his family's wealth. If they had kidnapped his infant daughter, if they had collected the $10 million ransom, and if they had used that blood money to raise their biological son while keeping the rightful heiress enslaved as a maid, the level of depravity was almost beyond human comprehension. "I suspect," Lawrence said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly murmur, "that I am about to tear this entire family apart with my bare hands. Get me that DNA confirmation, Bennett. Do whatever it takes." Lawrence Garrison turned and boarded the helicopter. The heavy doors slid shut, sealing him inside. The rotors spun up to maximum velocity, and the aircraft lifted off the manicured lawn, banking sharply toward the city. Bennett watched the helicopter disappear into the sky. He then turned his gaze back to the grand facade of the Hamptons estate. The security director adjusted his suit jacket, his expression hardening into a mask of pure tactical execution. He reached out and touched his earpiece, activating the secure comms channel for his embedded security team. "Lock down the perimeter." Bennett ordered his team, his voice calm and authoritative. "Nobody leaves the estate without my explicit authorization. Monitor all movement from Howard, Lydia, and Grant." Bennett walked briskly back toward the main house. He did not use the front entrance. He bypassed the frantic wedding planners and slipped through the side terrace doors, moving with the silent efficiency of a predator closing in on its target. He navigated the crowded hallways, avoiding the guests, his eyes scanning for the specific drawing room where the incident had occurred. He found it. The room was currently empty, the guests having migrated toward the outdoor brunch setup. The broken glass had been swept away, but Bennett was not looking for large shards. He walked directly to the center of the room near the marble pillar. He knelt down on the pristine Persian rug. There, stark against the white fabric, was a single unmistakable drop of dried blood. Bennett pulled a sterilized evidence collection kit from his pocket. He used a scalpel to carefully excise the small section of stained fabric. He dropped the sample into a secure vial, sealed it, and slipped it back into his pocket. He then scanned the floor near the edge of the rug. Tucked slightly beneath the leg of the side table, completely missed by the hasty cleanup, was a small, sharp, triangular shard of crystal. The jagged edge was smeared with dried crimson. Bennett collected the glass shard, sealing it in a second evidence tube. He stood up, adjusting his cuffs. He had the physical proof. He had the genetic material that would either confirm a billionaire's impossible hope or destroy a family's entire existence. He tapped his earpiece again. Bring the secondary chopper around to the south lawn, Bennett instructed his pilot. I have a package requiring immediate transport to the Manhattan lab. Tell Dr. Evans to prep the sequencer. We are running a priority 1 DNA extraction. Bennett turned and walked out of the drawing room. The countdown had begun. The fake prince was preparing for his wedding, oblivious to the fact that the true king was already mobilizing an army to reclaim his stolen throne. Down in the pitch-black wine cellar, the temperature had dropped significantly, but the freezing air felt entirely irrelevant to the fire burning inside my chest. The heavy oak door suddenly shuddered. The mechanical deadbolt scraped loudly against the iron frame. A blinding shaft of hallway light sliced through the darkness, forcing me to squint as the door swung open. Grant stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the harsh light. He was no longer wearing his bespoke suit jacket. His silk shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and he held a half-empty bottle of expensive bourbon in his left hand. The arrogant, triumphant sneer on his face was unmistakable. He swayed slightly, intoxicated by the alcohol and the delusional belief that he had actually won. He stepped into the cellar, kicking the heavy door shut behind him. The only illumination came from the faint glowing screen of the smartphone he held in his right hand. My smartphone. He had apparently raided my small duffel bag upstairs while I was trapped down here. Grant tossed a hard, stale piece of bread directly at my chest. It bounced off my gray-maid uniform and landed in the dust at my feet. "Eat up, servant," Grant slurred, taking a deep swig from the bourbon bottle. "You are going to need your strength for the long trip tomorrow." I looked down at the moldy crust, then back up at his flushed, sweating face. I did not speak. I gave him the blank, vacant stare he expected, fueling his narcissistic need to feel superior. Grant held up my standard smartphone, the screen illuminating his cruel smile. "Did you really think you could keep secrets from me?" he mocked. "I saw you typing on this earlier. You probably thought you could call some cheap pro bono lawyer or contact the local police. You probably thought someone out there would actually care about a pathetic dropout." He threw the phone onto the concrete floor with incredible force. He raised his heavy leather dress shoe and stomped down on the device repeatedly. The glass screen shattered with a loud crunch. He crushed the internal components into an unrecognizable pile of twisted metal and jagged glass, completely destroying the hardware. "There goes your lifeline," Grant laughed, kicking the broken pieces into the corner of the cellar. "You are entirely cut off from the world, Andrea. Nobody knows you are down here and nobody is coming to save you." I remained perfectly still, watching him destroy a decoy phone that contained absolutely zero sensitive information. My actual connection to Silas and the financial strike was the encrypted satellite device safely tucked beneath my apron. But Grant needed to believe he had disarmed me. He needed to feel like the absolute master of my fate. "You really almost ruined everything upstairs," Grant sneered, stepping closer until I could smell the sharp tang of bourbon on his breath. "Spilling wine on Lawrence Garrison, showing him that ugly scar on your neck. Mom and Dad are having a complete nervous breakdown in the master suite right now. They think Garrison is going to figure it out. They think the police are going to storm the gates." Grant threw his head back and laughed, a hollow, manic sound that bounced off the stone walls. "But they are just paranoid cowards," Grant continued, taking another aggressive swig from the bottle. "Garrison is an old fossil. He does not suspect a thing. He is just a wealthy mark handing over the keys to his empire. By this time tomorrow, I will be standing at the altar with Felicity. I will slip that massive diamond onto her finger, and I will officially become a principal shareholder in the Garrison oil dynasty. I will have more money, more legal immunity, and more political influence than the governor." He leaned in his face, inches from mine, his voice dropping to a vicious, threatening whisper. "And you know what happens to you 24 hours from now?" Grant asked, his eyes wide with sadistic glee. "The second the ink dries on that marriage certificate, I am executing the medical power of attorney. We have a private physician on the payroll who has already signed the psychiatric evaluation. He diagnosed you with severe aggressive schizophrenia." I stared into his eyes, maintaining my absolute silence as he laid out the final phase of his monstrous plan. "We are not just sending you to Macau anymore," Grant spat, pointing a finger at my chest. "That plan is dead, because you are too much of a liability to keep walking around free. Instead, you are going to be strapped to a gurney and driven to a highly classified maximum security psychiatric facility upstate. It is a private black site for wealthy families who need to make their embarrassing relatives disappear. You will be heavily sedated. You will be locked in a padded cell. You will never see the sun, and you will never speak to another human being for the rest of your miserable, pathetic life. He stepped back, surveying his perceived victory with immense satisfaction. Enjoy the dark. Andrea Grant mocked, turning toward the heavy oak door. It is exactly where a useless parasite like you belongs. He grabbed the iron handle, pulled the door open, and stepped out into the hallway. The heavy door slammed shut. The deadbolt slid into place with a definitive metallic thud. The pitch-black darkness returned, suffocating and total. I stood in the center of the cold cellar, listening to his footsteps fade away down the basement corridor. The silence wrapped around me. A normal person would have been paralyzed by terror. A normal person would have collapsed onto the freezing concrete and wept at the sheer horror of being committed to a psychiatric black site. I simply let out a slow, steady breath. I reached down and grasped the heel of my cheap black leather loafer. The shoes were standard issue for the catering staff, but I had customized this specific pair months ago, anticipating a scenario exactly like this. I dug my fingernail into the rubber seam along the sole. With a sharp tug, the entire bottom of the shoe popped open, revealing a hollowed-out cavity inside the thick heel. I reached into the hidden compartment. My fingers brushed against cold, hard plastic. I pulled out a second ultra-compact micro-satellite phone. It was barely the size of a matchbox, completely undetectable by standard security sweeps, and operated on an entirely separate military frequency from my primary device. I flipped open the tiny screen. The harsh, bright light illuminated my face in the darkness. The signal strength indicator showed maximum bars. Grant thought he had severed my vocal cords. He thought he had crushed my only weapon into the concrete floor. He believed his marriage to Felicity would grant him ultimate invincibility. He was completely unaware that Silas had already weaponized the financial markets against him, and he was entirely ignorant of the biological storm Lawrence Garrison was currently brewing in a Manhattan laboratory. I held the tiny device in the palm of my hand. A cold, dangerous smile spread across my face, cutting through the shadows of the wine cellar. The fake prince had just delivered his final monologue. Now it was time to bring down the curtain. I pressed my thumb against the power button on the side of the micro-satellite phone. The tiny screen flared to life, casting a harsh, icy blue glow against the damp stone walls of my prison. I bypassed the standard security protocols with practiced efficiency, entering a complex sequence of encrypted passcodes that connected me directly to my private server network. Within seconds, the secure line clicked open. "Silas," I said, keeping my voice low and perfectly steady, "we have a slight change of schedule." "I am here, boss," Silas replied instantly, his tone shifting from professional calm to immediate alert. "I see your location ping. Why is your signal originating from the subterranean level of the estate?" "Grant locked me in the wine cellar," I explained, staring into the darkness ahead of me. "He just paid me a visit to gloat. He was kind enough to outline his backup plan in vivid detail." I quickly relayed the contents of Grant's horrifying drunken monologue. I told Silas about the forged medical documents, the private physician on their payroll, and the highly classified psychiatric black site upstate. I detailed their intention to strap me to a gurney, sedate me, and lock me in a padded cell for the rest of my life the second the marriage certificate was signed. Silas, usually the consummate, unflappable professional, let out a sharp, ragged breath of genuine shock. "That is a completely new level of depravity. They are planning to bury you alive. I am dispatching our private security contractors to your coordinates right now. We are extracting you from that basement immediately." "No," I commanded, my voice slicing through his panic with absolute authority. "Do not send anyone. I am exactly where I need to be. We are going to let them think they have won until the very last second. I want them standing at the altar, bloated with arrogance, believing their future is secured. I need you to execute the final real estate acquisition. I want it done right this second." Howard and Lydia had remortgaged the Hamptons property 3 separate times over the past decade to fund Grant's lavish lifestyle and prop up his fraudulent hedge fund. The debt they carried on this mansion was astronomical and unsustainable house of cards, held together by blind denial. Silas authorized the primary holding company to purchase the master mortgage debt from their lender. I instructed my eyes tracing the rough, cold stone of the cellar walls. I want the deed transferred to my corporate entity immediately. I want full, undisputed ownership of the ground I am currently locked underneath. I could hear the frantic, rapid clicking of a mechanical keyboard on the other end of the line as Silas navigated the global banking channels. Bypassing the standard escrow delays, Silas murmured, entirely focused on the digital execution. Routing the funds through the Cayman accounts to clear the bank's domestic hurdles. The wire transfer is processing. The lender has accepted the full buyout. The deed is being digitally reassigned to your primary LLC. A fierce, triumphant thrill coursed through my veins. "Congratulations, boss," Silas announced, his voice ringing with grim satisfaction. "The transaction is complete. You officially own the Hamptons estate. Howard, Lydia, and Grant are technically trespassing on your private property as we speak." "Perfect," I whispered, pressing my back against the heavy oak door that kept me caged. "Now I need you to grant me remote access to the estate's smart home network." The wedding planners spent the entire week installing a centralized wireless audio-visual system for the ceremony tomorrow. It controls the surround sound speakers hidden across the main lawn, the grand foyer, and the banquet hall. "Sending the backdoor access codes to your device now," Silas confirmed. A string of complex numeric codes populated the tiny screen in my palm. My fingers flew across the miniature digital keyboard. I bypassed the wedding DJ's superficial firewall with almost laughable ease. The entire multi-million-dollar audio network of the estate was now completely under my direct control. I accessed my secure cloud server and pulled up the encrypted audio file I had recorded earlier in the VIP wine room. The file contained Grant's exact words, his sickening, arrogant laughter, his complete confession to his massive underground gambling debts, and his detailed, grotesque plot to traffic his own sister to Macau to pay them off. I uploaded the high-definition audio file directly into the master queue of the wedding playlist. I did not just add it to the mix. I went deep into the system architecture and overrode the administrative permissions. I locked the audio file into the primary broadcast channel, encrypting the command so it could not be paused, muted, or skipped by the DJ or anyone else at the control booth. I linked the file directly to the master volume controls, forcing the output to broadcast at maximum decibels across every single speaker on the property. "Silas," I murmured, staring at the uploading progress bar on my tiny screen, "what exact time is the bride scheduled to walk down the aisle?" "The official itinerary states the procession begins exactly at 11 in the morning," Silas replied, anticipating my next move. "Set the trigger timer for 11:05. I instructed, a cold smile touching my lips. "Right when the priest asks if anyone objects to this union, I want every single speaker on this entire estate to broadcast Grant's confession simultaneously. I want Felicity, her billionaire father, and every elite high society guest in attendance to hear exactly what kind of monster is standing at the altar." "Timer is set, synchronized, and locked," Silas confirmed, a dark chuckle escaping his lips. "The audio override protocol is completely undetectable until the exact moment it triggers. The DJ will have absolutely no control over his own equipment. Grant is walking straight into a public execution." I closed the network application and locked the device. The trap was perfectly, flawlessly laid. The financial ruin was entirely secured. The massive property I was trapped in now legally belonged to me. The audio bomb was ticking down in the digital shadows, waiting to obliterate their fake empire. "Silas," I said, a profound, unshakable sense of peace washing over my exhausted body. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we watch the kingdom fall." "Good night, boss," Silas replied. "Enjoy your house." I severed the connection and powered down the micro-satellite phone, plunging myself back into the pitch-black darkness of the wine cellar. I slipped the tiny device back into the hollowed-out heel of my catering shoe and clicked the rubber sole firmly into place. I slid down the rough wooden door, crossing my legs on the freezing concrete floor, and closed my eyes. I was locked inside a lightless cage, starved and bruised, but I had never felt more powerful, more alive, or more absolutely free. The sunrise was coming, and with it the absolute destruction of everything they held dear. Lawrence Garrison sat in his glass-walled office on the 50th floor of Garrison Tower. The Manhattan skyline was a cold strip of steel and flickering lights only just beginning to soften under the first gray streaks of dawn. He hadn't slept. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the face of the maid at the Hamptons mansion. He saw those eyes that looked exactly like his late wife's, and he saw the silver V-shaped scar. It was a ghost that had haunted his life for 32 years, and now it stood in its gray uniform polishing his shoes. At precisely 5 o'clock in the morning, the silence in the room was broken by the sharp clinical ping of the security terminal. Lawrence lunged to the screen, his fingers trembling with a weakness he hadn't felt in decades. An email from Garrison's private lab. No subject line, only an attachment. His heart pounded in his chest like a trapped bird as he clicked open the document. It was a comparative DNA analysis. On the left, his own genetic sequence. On the right, the sequence extracted from sample A blood found on a shard of crystal from the Hamptons' living room. He scanned the dense allele sequences and markers, his vision blurring, until he reached the final line. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. The tablet slipped from Lawrence's hand, slamming against the mahogany table with a heavy thud. For a moment, the world simply ceased to exist. The air in the room turned liquid, heavy, and suffocating. The cold, logical oil billionaire who had crushed rivals and built a global empire was gone. In his place was a father who had spent 3 decades mourning a ghost. He let out a sound, a choked, violent sob he had suppressed since that rainy night in 1992 when the baby's crib in the maternity ward was found empty. Andrea, his daughter. She wasn't dead. She wasn't a memory. She was alive, and she was being treated like trash by the very people who had stolen her. His pain lasted only a minute before it was consumed by a white volcanic rage. The transformation was horrific. His face hardened into a mask of deadly concentrated rage. He understood it all. Howard and Lydia, the way they had loitered around, the way they had lied about her age. They hadn't just found an orphan, they had stolen his baby. They had taken his ransom. And then they had spent 30 years forcing his own flesh and blood to serve them as slaves. Lawrence rose, his movements fluid and precise. The predator had awakened. He reached for the phone and dialed Bennett directly. "Benneter Lawrence," said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl carrying the weight of a death sentence. "I have the results," Sir Bennett replied, his voice equally grave. "My team is ready." 99.99%, Lawrence said hoarsely, his hand gripping the edge of the table so tightly the wood creaked. "She's mine, Bennett. And they've held her captive in a cage for 28 years. The line fell silent for a moment as the security chief took in the gravity of the crime. "What are your orders, sir? Are we going in now?" "We're only 5 minutes from the gate." Lawrence looked at his watch. 5:15. The wedding was at 11. If he acted now, they would escape. If he acted now, the world wouldn't see their humiliation. He didn't just want them in jail. He wanted to wipe them out. He wanted to wait until they were at the height of their arrogance, until they thought they had finally gotten their hands on his billions of dollars, and then he would skin them alive right in front of all the people they tried to impress. "No," Lawrence ordered, his voice as cold as liquid nitrogen. "We're not attacking yet, but you lock down the estate. I want a complete perimeter lockdown. I want my elite task force in plain clothes, no uniforms. I want them to look like guests, waiters, or gardeners. No one is to leave the estate," Lawrence demanded. "Inner and outer perimeters. Internal surveillance of every door and window. If Howard, Lydia, or that bastard Grant dares to sneeze toward a car, you take them down on the spot. Only inside movement is allowed. But absolutely do not let them know they are surrounded. Let them continue the charade. Let them wear those expensive suits and put on those fake smiles. And what about the girl? Sir Bennet asked. Andrea. We believe she is being held in the basement. Our thermal scans show signs of heat in the wine cellar area. Lawrence's jaw clenched until it ached. His eyes closed, picturing his daughter in a cold basement while her kidnappers prepared for a celebration on the lawn above. Keep an eye on her. If her life is in immediate danger, break through the wall. But if she's all right, we'll wait until the ceremony. I want her to come out of that darkness and face them at the altar. I want her to see me take everything from them. He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper that could terrify a lion. And Bennett, make sure the rescue team for Andrea is the best we have. When this is over, I want her safe. I want her to watch me destroy those who stole her life. The perimeter has been established, sir, Bennett confirmed. The Hamptons mansion is now a cage. They just don't know it yet. Lawrence ended the call. He stepped out the window and watched the sun finally rise over the city. It was a beautiful morning for a wedding, and it was a perfect morning for a massacre. He spent the next few hours in a state of controlled madness. He pulled out the 1992 case file from his private safe. He looked at the old hospital records Bennett had just unearthed. There it was. Lydia was registered as a nursing assistant. Howard worked as a night security guard for that facility. They were the ones supposed to be protecting newborn babies. Instead, they had targeted the wealthiest family in the area. They had planned it with a coldness that made his blood boil. The ransom paid was $10 million. Untraceable cash was dropped in a Midwest forest. Lawrence had paid it gleefully, thinking it was the price for his daughter's safety. He never suspected that the kidnappers had no intention of returning her. They kept her as a backup plan, a way to ensure he never stopped searching in the wrong direction. He looked at the recent financial files. Silas had sent files from Andrea, his analyst. Now he understood why her work had been so brilliant. She had his intellect, she had his risk-taking instincts, and she had used them to dismantle the family that had imprisoned her. He felt a wave of pride surge through him, almost overwhelming his rage. She was a garrison. Even in chains, she was a queen. By 8 o'clock in the morning, Lawrence sat in his tinted glass Suburban speeding toward the Hamptons. He watched the live feed from Bennett's tactical cameras on his iPad. He saw florists arranging white roses. He saw food trucks being searched by his men in disguise. He saw Grant the imposter standing on the balcony with a glass of champagne, gazing out at the ocean as if he owned the horizon. "Enjoy the view," Lawrence whispered into the screen. "Because in 3 hours, you won't even have the air in your lungs." He arrived at the command post, an unmarked van parked a mile from the mansion at 9:30. Bennett met him at the door. "All the teams are in position, sir. We have a sniper on the hillside next door monitoring from above. All escape routes are blocked. Howard and Lydia are in the bridal suite with Felicity. They're playing the role of a devoted family." Lawrence nodded, his face like a granite wall. "And my daughter?" "Still in the cellar, sir. She hasn't moved. She seems to be resting." Lawrence checked his watch. 10 o'clock. An hour until the parade begins. He felt a cruel satisfaction finally. He had waited 32 years for this moment. He could wait another 60 minutes. "Prepare for my arrival," Lawrence said. "I'll be in the front row. I want the iPad connected to the main projector in the banquet hall. When I give the signal, we're not just stopping the wedding. We're going to broadcast the truth to every guest, every member of the elite, and every news agency in the state. The blockade is absolute." The Hamptons mansion was now a vacuum. Information flowed in, but nothing flowed out. Garrison's task force moved like ghosts among the wedding staff, their weapons concealed but their eyes sharp. The trap was locked. The executioner was in the front row, and the ghosts of 99-2 were finally home to collect their debts. The faint melodic strains of a string quartet filtered down through the floorboards of the mansion. Above me, the lavish Hamptons wedding was officially beginning. I could envision the scene perfectly. Hundreds of white roses adorning the manicured lawn, the elite guests taking their seats in the folding mahogany chairs, the ocean breeze carrying the scent of expensive perfume and sea salt. Grant would be standing at the altar in his custom tuxedo, his heart pounding not with love for Felicity, but with the greedy anticipation of securing the Garrison fortune. Howard and Lydia would be sitting in the front row, their chests puffed out with fraudulent pride, utterly convinced they had successfully pulled off the greatest heist of their miserable lives. And sitting just a few feet away from them would be Lawrence Garrison, the billionaire oil tycoon, the man who now knew the truth. I sat on the freezing concrete floor of the wine cellar and checked the glowing screen of my micro-satellite phone. The time read exactly 10:50. The digital audio bomb I had planted in the estate's sound system was locked and ticking down, scheduled to detonate in precisely 15 minutes. Silas had executed his financial strikes perfectly. The trap was fully armed. But I was not going to sit in the dark and let the automated systems do all the work. I needed to look my abusers in the eye when their fake empire collapsed. I stood up, my muscles stiff from the cold dampness of the room. I engaged the flashlight function on my device, casting a narrow beam of white light across the dusty oak racks and stone walls. I needed a way out. Howard had locked the deadbolt from the outside, assuming a supposedly weak, defeated maid would simply curl up in a corner and cry. He severely underestimated my sheer willpower. I swept the light across the far corner of the cellar. Tucked behind a stack of empty wooden wine crates, I spotted a heavy vintage cast-iron fire extinguisher mounted to the stone wall. It was thick and cylindrical, easily weighing 20 pounds. I walked over and pulled it from its metal bracket. The cold iron felt solid and reassuring in my hands. It was the perfect battering ram. I approached the heavy oak door. I did not waste energy screaming for help. I gripped the fire extinguisher with both hands, planting my feet firmly on the concrete floor. I swung the heavy iron cylinder backward, twisting my torso to generate maximum momentum, and drove it violently into the center of the wooden door panel, right where the deadbolt mechanism was housed. The impact was deafening. The loud, brutal crack echoed off the stone walls, vibrating through my arms and up to my shoulders. The solid oak splintered, but the lock held. I did not hesitate. I swung again. The iron smashed into the wood with a sickening crunch. The metal plate of the deadbolt buckled inward. I swung a third time, pouring 28 years of suppressed rage, forced servitude, and psychological torture into the strike. The heavy door groaned in protest. The wooden frame around the lock shattered completely. With one final ruthless kick from my heavy catering shoe, the door flew open, slamming against the hallway wall. I stepped out of the pitch-black cellar and into the dimly lit basement corridor. I dropped the fire extinguisher. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, rolling away into the shadows. I took a deep breath of the stale basement air. I looked down at my gray maid uniform. It was covered in gray dust, damp earth, and the dark, dried stains of the vintage wine Grant had thrown in my face. My hair had fallen completely out of its neat bun, hanging wildly over my shoulders. My knuckles were scraped and my hands were dirty. I looked like an absolute disaster. I looked like a servant who had been dragged through the mud, and it was exactly the image I wanted to present. I did not try to smooth my clothes. I did not try to fix my hair. This dirt and grime was the physical manifestation of their cruelty. It was my battle armor. I marched up the concrete basement stairs, my cheap leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the steps. I pushed through the swinging doors into the main industrial kitchen. The catering staff bustling around with trays of expensive appetizers froze instantly. A dozen pairs of eyes widened in shock as they took in my disheveled, fierce appearance. The head chef opened his mouth to shout at me, but the sheer lethal intensity burning in my eyes silenced him instantly. I did not speak. I simply walked right past them, cutting a straight path through the kitchen and out into the grand foyer. The interior of the mansion was completely empty, the guests having all migrated to the back lawn for the ceremony. The front doors were propped open, letting in the bright morning sunlight. I walked across the foyer, my steps echoing against the marble floor. I approached the massive French doors that opened out onto the sprawling green lawn. Outside, the string quartet was playing a soft, elegant melody. Through the glass, I could see the massive crowd of guests seated facing the ocean. Felicity was already standing at the altar, her white lace gown catching the ocean breeze. Grant stood opposite her, holding her hands, playing the role of the devoted, wealthy groom. The priest stood between them holding a leather-bound book, his voice carrying clearly over the high-definition speakers I had secretly hijacked. I placed my hands on the brass handles of the French doors. I pushed them open. The bright sunlight hit my face, temporarily blinding me, but I did not stop walking. I stepped onto the pristine white carpet runner that stretched all the way down the center aisle. I walked with a slow, deliberate, predatory grace. My gray dirt-covered maid uniform stood out like a violent gash against the sea of pastel dresses and expensive black tuxedos. As I moved down the aisle, heads began to turn. Whispers rippled through the back rows, spreading forward like a tidal wave of confusion and shock. The elegant guests stared at the filthy, bruised servant marching toward the altar with the posture of an invading queen. Grant did not notice me at first. He was too focused on maintaining his fake smile for Felicity. Howard and Lydia were seated in the very front row, their backs to me, completely oblivious to the nightmare approaching from behind. But Lawrence Garrison saw me. The billionaire was seated on the bride's side in the front row. He turned his head, his sharp dark eyes locking onto mine. He saw the dirt. He saw the bruises. He saw the gray uniform. A muscle in his jaw twitched, his hands balling into tight fists, resting on his knees. He did not say a word, but the lethal promise in his eyes was absolute. I reached the halfway point of the aisle, just as the music faded into silence. The priest looked up from his book, his eyes widening in utter disbelief as he caught sight of me marching toward the altar. He faltered, clearing his throat awkwardly, trying to maintain the decorum of the ceremony. If anyone here knows any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony. The priest recited, his voice trembling slightly over the microphone. Speak now or forever, hold your peace. I stopped walking. I stood directly in the center of the aisle, right behind my fake parents. The silence on the lawn was absolute, thick with a suffocating, terrifying tension. I object, I stated. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the ocean breeze like a sharpened blade. The words echoed across the manicured lawn. Grant's head snapped up. Howard and Lydia whipped around in their chairs. The blood drained instantly from their faces, leaving them looking like hollow, terrified ghosts. The fake prince and his counterfeit empire were staring directly at the architect of their destruction. The final execution had officially begun. Howard broke the paralyzed silence. He vaulted over the front row of mahogany chairs, his face contorted into a mask of homicidal panic. He lunged toward me, his hands reaching for my throat, desperate to silence me before I could utter another word. He never made it. Before Howard could cross the distance, Lawrence Garrison stepped out of the front row. The billionaire moved with a terrifying, explosive speed that belied his age. He intercepted Howard mid-stride, driving his shoulder into Howard's chest and shoving the fake patriarch violently backward. Howard stumbled and crashed hard onto the pristine white carpet, gasping for air. "Do not ever touch my daughter again," Lawrence commanded. His voice was a low, seismic rumble that shook the very foundation of the manicured lawn. The guests gasped in unison. Felicity dropped her bridal bouquet. Grant stared at his prospective father-in-law, as if the billionaire had suddenly spoken in a foreign language. "Mr. Garrison!" Howard wheezed, scrambling backward on the grass. "You do not understand. This maid is mentally unwell. She is having a psychotic break. We need to call the authorities to have her removed." "I already called the authorities," Lawrence replied, smoothing the lapels of his suit jacket with chilling calm. "In fact, I brought my own." Bennett. At the sound of the security director's name, the entire atmosphere of the wedding completely transformed. The polite, wealthy guests suddenly found themselves trapped in a military-grade lockdown. The catering staff serving champagne near the back rows dropped their silver trays and reached beneath their white jackets. The gardeners pruning the hedges stepped out onto the lawn, revealing tactical communication earpieces. Over 40 plainclothes armed security contractors converged on the ceremony space, forming an impenetrable human wall around the perimeter of the estate. "Nobody moves," Bennett announced, stepping onto the altar beside Lawrence. His hand rested firmly on the holster concealed beneath his tailored suit. "The perimeter is fully locked down. Nothing goes in and absolutely nothing comes out." Grant looked wildly around the lawn, the arrogant swagger completely drained from his posture. "What is this?" Grant demanded, his voice cracking with fear. Felicity, what is your father doing? We are supposed to be getting married. There is no wedding today, boy, Lawrence stated, his eyes locking onto Grant with absolute disgust. You are not marrying my daughter. You are not touching a single dime of my family's wealth. You are going to spend the rest of your miserable life in a federal penitentiary right alongside your kidnapper parents. Lydia let out a shrill, hysterical scream. She covered her mouth with trembling hands, backing away from the altar until she hit the floral archway. You see, Howard Lawrence continued, stepping closer to the cowering man on the ground. I did not sleep last night. I spent the entire night pacing my office in Manhattan. I had my security director secure the drop of blood your wife so graciously forced from Andrea's hand when she shattered that crystal glass yesterday. I had it flown via a secondary helicopter directly to my private medical laboratory. Howard's eyes rolled wildly in his skull. He was having a severe panic attack, his chest heaving as the reality of his execution set in. At exactly 5 in the morning, Lawrence said, pulling a sleek titanium tablet from his interior pocket, the chief geneticist sent me the final sequencing report. I sat in my office and watched the sun rise over the city while looking at a 99.99% genetic match. Lawrence held the tablet high, the bright screen displaying the official laboratory insignia and the undeniable DNA confirmation. For 32 years, I searched the globe for my stolen infant daughter. Lawrence's voice cracked with raw, agonizing grief, but quickly hardened back into a weapon of mass destruction. I paid your $10 million ransom. I followed every dead-end lead. I spent millions of dollars on private investigators. And all this time you were hiding her in plain sight. You used my ransom money to buy this ridiculous mansion, to fund your fraudulent businesses, and to raise your biological son as a spoiled, entitled prince. You took the rightful heir to the Garrison Empire and forced her to scrub your floors. Tears streamed down Felicity's face. She looked at me, taking in the bruises, the dirt-covered uniform, and the sheer exhaustion etched into my features. She then looked at Grant, dropping his hand, as if his skin had suddenly caught fire. You knew about this, Felicity whispered, backing away from the groom. You knew who she was, and you kept her as a slave. Felicity, no, Grant pleaded, reaching out for her. I swear I did not know she was your sister. I just thought she was an orphan my parents took in. I am innocent. Do not lie to me. I spoke up, my voice cutting through his pathetic groveling. I took a step forward, closing the distance between myself and the altar. I pulled my micro-satellite phone from my pocket and held it up for the entire crowd to see. Grant locked me in this pitch-black wine cellar last night, I announced to the captive audience. He came down to gloat. He told me that as soon as the marriage certificate was signed, he and my fake parents were going to enact a fraudulent medical power of attorney. They were going to have me declared severely schizophrenic and permanently committed to a maximum security psychiatric black site upstate. He planned to lock me in a padded cell so I could never reveal the truth. The guests erupted in horrified murmurs. Felicity let out a choked sob of pure disgust, fleeing from the altar to take shelter behind her father's security team. That is a lie, Howard screamed, scrambling to his feet. She is making this up. She is trying to destroy us. I smiled. It was a cold, ruthless expression that made Howard freeze in his tracks. I do not need to make anything up, I replied calmly. Because I recorded every single word your son said in that wine cellar last night. Just like I recorded his confession in the VIP room about his $2 million offshore gambling debt and his plan to traffic me to an elderly shipping magnate to pay it off. I raised my hand and signaled to Silas, who I knew was monitoring the live feed from my device. Hit the audio, Silas, I commanded. Instantly, the high-definition surround sound speakers hidden across the manicured lawn roared to life. The wedding march was entirely replaced by the crisp, undeniable audio recording of Grant's drunken, arrogant voice echoing from the cellar. The speakers blasted his vicious threats, his detailed explanation of the fraudulent medical documents, and his sadistic promise to lock me in a dark hole for the rest of my life. The recording played at maximum volume, impossible to ignore, impossible to deny. The elite guests listened in absolute paralyzed horror as the groom exposed himself as a monstrous, calculating criminal. Grant covered his ears, dropping to his knees on the white carpet runner. He squeezed his eyes shut, sobbing hysterically as his own voice condemned him to decades in federal prison. Lydia collapsed against the floral archway, wailing loudly, her pristine reputation shattered into a million irreparable pieces. "Turn it off," Howard begged, covering his face with his hands. "Please turn it off." Lawrence Garrison walked over to me. He did not look at the crying, pathetic criminals writhing on the grass. He looked at me, his eyes shining with profound pride and overwhelming love. He reached out and gently touched my shoulder, being careful not to press on the bruises Lydia had left. "You survived them," Lawrence whispered, his voice meant only for me. "You fought them from the inside, and you tore their empire down to the studs. You are a Garrison through and through." I looked up at my real father, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of the past 28 years finally lift from my chest. The audio recording finished playing, leaving the lawn in a heavy, ringing silence. The execution was complete. The trap had snapped shut. Now it was time to collect the spoils. Bennett raised his right hand, giving a sharp, definitive nod to the perimeter. The illusion of the high society wedding dissolved in a fraction of a second. A dozen men and women who had been seamlessly blending in as wealthy wedding guests suddenly dropped their champagne flutes and converged on the altar. They reached beneath their tailored suits and designer dresses, pulling out silver badges and heavy steel handcuffs. Federal agents, a tall man in a dark blue suit, announced, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. He stepped onto the white carpet runner, holding his badge high for everyone to see. "Howard and Lydia, you are both under arrest." The federal agents moved with ruthless, practiced efficiency. Two officers grabbed Howard by the shoulders, forcing his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed over the murmuring crowd. Howard gasped, his knees buckling, but the agents held him upright. Another pair of officers secured Lydia. She thrashed wildly, screaming and kicking, her carefully styled hair flying in every direction as the cold steel clamped down on her wrists. "You are being charged with the kidnapping of a minor, extortion, medical fraud, and grand larceny," the lead agent stated, reading from a document he pulled from his jacket. "Furthermore, you face federal charges for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit human trafficking. You have the right to remain silent, and I highly suggest you use it." "This is a mistake," Lydia shrieked, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "We did not kidnap anyone. She was abandoned. We saved her. We are good people. Tell them, Howard. Tell them we are innocent." Howard did not speak. His eyes were wide and vacant, staring blankly at the manicured grass. The reality of his impending imprisonment had completely shattered his mind. He knew there was no escape. He knew the authorities had already seized the medical records, the offshore accounts, and the decades of forged documents thanks to my transmission. Grant, who had been kneeling on the ground in a state of catatonic shock from the audio broadcast, suddenly snapped back to reality. Seeing his parents in handcuffs triggered a desperate, delusional surge of adrenaline. He scrambled to his feet, his custom tuxedo grass stained and wrinkled. "Get your hands off my parents!" Grant roared, lunging toward the federal agents. "Do you have any idea who you are dealing with? I am marrying into the Garrison family. My father-in-law is Lawrence Garrison. I will have your badges for this. I will buy this entire police department and fire every single one of you." He reached out to shove the lead agent, but Bennett intercepted him with effortless, brutal speed. The security director grabbed Grant by the collar of his silk shirt and threw him backward. Grant hit the turf hard, gasping for air. Before Grant could recover, Lawrence Garrison stepped forward. The billionaire towered over the pathetic, frantic groom. Lawrence looked down at Grant with an expression of such absolute freezing contempt that it seemed to lower the temperature of the entire lawn. "You are not marrying into my family," Lawrence stated, his voice a lethal, vibrating bass. "You are not my son-in-law. You are absolutely nothing." Grant shook his head frantically, holding his hands up in a pleading gesture. "Mr. Garrison, please, you have to listen to me. I did not know about the kidnapping, I swear on my life. My parents hid it from me. I thought she was just an adopted maid. I love Felicity. I am a successful hedge fund manager. I belong in your family." Lawrence let out a sharp, humorless laugh that cut through the ocean breeze like a scythe. "A successful hedge fund manager. You are a degenerate gambling addict whose entire existence was funded by my grief. You do not have a single legitimate accomplishment to your name. Every suit you wear, every car you drive, and every breath you take was paid for with the $10 million ransom your monstrous parents extorted from me 32 years ago." Grant's jaw dropped. He looked from Lawrence to his handcuffed parents, the horrific realization finally penetrating his arrogant skull. "You are their biological son," Lawrence continued his words, striking like physical blows. "You are the product of the two most disgusting criminals I have ever had the misfortune to encounter. They stole my infant daughter, subjected her to decades of abuse, and used my money to raise you like a prince. You are a parasite feeding off the blood of my child." "I am a millionaire," Grant stammered, his mind fracturing as his entire identity was ripped away. "I have a hedge fund. I have assets." "You have zero liquidity," I interjected, stepping up beside my true father. Grant snapped his head toward me, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "Silas locked your accounts last night," I explained, looking down at him with icy satisfaction. "Your banks have frozen your credit. Your offshore holdings are currently being seized by federal regulators due to the audio evidence of money laundering and trafficking that I provided. You are completely bankrupt, Grant." Grant let out a strangled, pathetic noise. He turned toward Felicity, reaching his hand out in a desperate final plea. "Felicity, please. I love you. We can start over." Felicity looked at him with pure, unadulterated revulsion. She stepped out from behind her father's security detail. She grabbed the $2 million diamond engagement ring off her finger and threw it directly at Grant's chest. "Do not ever speak my name again," Felicity said, her voice shaking with disgust. "You are a monster." The ring bounced off his chest and landed in the dirt. Grant stared at the glittering diamond, the last physical symbol of his fabricated wealth, lying in the mud. He opened his mouth to beg, but no sound came out. The illusion was dead. The fake prince was utterly broken. "Take them away," Lawrence ordered the federal agents, turning his back on the horrific family. "I never want to see their faces again." The agents hauled Howard and Lydia toward the waiting black SUVs parked at the edge of the estate. Lydia kicked and screamed the entire way, her wails echoing across the property. Howard dragged his feet, a hollow shell of the tyrant who had ruled my life. Grant remained on the grass, clutching his head, rocking back and forth as his reality crumbled into dust. I watched them being shoved into the back of the federal vehicles. For 28 years I had cleaned their messes. I had absorbed their hatred. I had believed their lies. But as the heavy car doors slammed shut, sealing them inside their new permanent cages, the final remnants of the terrified servant washed away completely. I was Andrea Garrison, and I had just taken my life back. The black SUVs carrying Howard and Lydia vanished down the long driveway, leaving a trail of dust and shattered illusions in their wake. But Grant was still on the grass. His mind, poisoned by decades of unearned privilege, simply refused to accept the reality of his absolute ruin. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the $2 million diamond ring lying in the mud. His eyes darted wildly, searching for a lifeline. He locked onto Felicity, who was being gently guided away by her father's security detail. "Wait!" Grant screamed, his voice cracking with desperate delusion. "Felicity, please wait. You cannot just leave me. We belong together. I can fix this." He lunged forward, closing the distance before the guards could intercept him. He fell to his knees again, his hands reaching out to grab the heavy lace hem of her custom bridal gown. Felicity stopped. She looked down at his grasping hands with a level of revulsion reserved for venomous insects. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply reached down and grabbed the massive, tightly bound bridal bouquet of white roses and heavy orchids she had dropped earlier. With a swift, furious motion, Felicity swung the heavy floral arrangement directly into Grant's face. The thick stems and hidden thorns struck his cheek with a loud smack. Delicate white petals exploded into the air, raining down over his custom tuxedo like a mocking snowfall. Grant recoiled, crying out in shock as a thin red scratch materialized across his jawline. "Do not ever touch me again," Felicity commanded, her voice dropping to a freezing, lethal register. "You are a disgusting fraud." She turned on her heel and walked away, the security guards closing ranks behind her, leaving Grant entirely isolated on the ruined wedding aisle. Panic, pure and unadulterated, finally seized him. His breathing became erratic. He patted his pockets frantically, his hands shaking so violently he looked like he was suffering from hypothermia. He pulled out his smartphone. He ignored the banking alerts flashing across the screen. He knew the domestic accounts were gone, but he had a secret. He had a private, heavily encrypted offshore reserve fund in the Cayman Islands, a shadow account he had hidden from everyone, even his own parents. It held just enough cash to charter a private flight and disappear. He swiped roughly at the cracked screen, pulling up the international dialing app. He punched in the numbers, his fingers slipping on the glass. In his frantic state, his thumb hit the speaker button. The dial tone echoed loudly across the silent, tense lawn, amplified by the proximity to the altar microphones. "Welcome to Apex International Banking," a smooth, automated voice announced through the phone speaker. "Please enter your secure account identification number." Grant rapidly typed in a 12-digit code, his chest heaving with desperate hope. He just needed one transfer, one wire to secure his escape. "We are processing your request," the automated voice stated. A brief pause stretched into an eternity. Grant held his breath. Then the voice returned, devoid of any human empathy. "We regret to inform you that this account has been permanently frozen under order of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. All assets have been seized pending a federal money laundering inquiry. For further assistance, please contact the authorities. Goodbye." The call disconnected with a sharp final click. "No," Grant screamed, slamming his fist against the grass. "No, no, no. That account was untraceable. That was my money." I stepped forward, the soft crunch of my cheap leather shoes against the white carpet runner drawing his wild, bloodshot eyes toward me. I walked slowly up the short flight of wooden stairs, stepping onto the elevated floral altar where he was supposed to take his vows. I stood at the podium, looking down at the pathetic, broken man kneeling in the dirt. "It was untraceable to a standard audit," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the lawn, calm and absolutely lethal. "But it was not untraceable to Silas. I told you, Grant. I provided the federal regulators with every single financial record, every hidden shell company, and every illegal offshore transaction you ever made. There is no backup plan. There is no secret vault." Grant stared up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked at my dirt-covered gray maid uniform, finally realizing that the woman he had treated like a subhuman servant possessed an intellect that had completely outmaneuvered his entire existence. "You destroyed my life," Grant sobbed, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. "You took everything from me." "I did not take anything that rightfully belonged to you," I replied, gripping the edges of the wooden podium. "I simply reclaimed what was mine. But I did not stop there. I wanted to make sure you understood exactly what it feels like to be stripped of your dignity." I pulled a thick folded legal document from the pocket of my apron. I held it up for him to see. The official seal of the state banking authority gleamed in the morning sun. "This house, your sports car, and your shell company," I announced, my voice ringing with undeniable authority. "I have seized them all as your primary creditor. Last night, I used my holding firm to purchase every single piece of master mortgage debt your fake parents defaulted on. The deed to this Hamptons estate was legally transferred to my name at exactly 2 o'clock this morning." Grant shook his head, his eyes wide with horror. "You do not have that kind of capital." "I have more capital than you could ever comprehend," I stated coldly. "I own the ground you are kneeling on. I own the roof over your head." I walked down the steps of the altar, stopping just a few feet away from him. I looked directly into his eyes, ensuring my next words would burn themselves into his memory for the rest of his life. "You once said I was born to be a servant," I said, lowering my voice to a dangerous, freezing whisper. "You said I was a useless stray who would be thrown out on the street with nothing but the clothes on her back." I paused, letting the absolute irony of his own words settle heavily over him. "Congratulations, Grant." I continued, a razor-sharp smile curving my lips. Starting from this exact second, you are officially homeless. You are trespassing on my private property. You have exactly 5 minutes to get off my land before I have you arrested for criminal intrusion." Grant stared at me completely paralyzed. The arrogant prince had been utterly decimated. The kingdom he thought he ruled was a mirage, and the servant he had tortured was the architect of his demise. He looked at the armed security contractors forming a tightening circle around him. He looked at Lawrence Garrison, who watched the execution with silent, profound approval. "You are a monster." Grant choked out his voice, barely a whisper. "No," I replied, turning my back on him. "I am simply the consequence of your actions. Now get off my property." I nodded to Bennett's security team. Two massive men stepped forward, grabbing Grant roughly by the arms and hauling him to his feet. They did not give him a chance to protest. They dragged the crying, ruined groom down the aisle, marching him toward the front gates to throw him out into the street with absolutely nothing but a torn, dirty tuxedo. Grant lunged with a sudden, animalistic desperation, his fingernails raking across the white carpet as he broke free from the security guards for one final pathetic second. He did not run for the exit. He collapsed at the base of the altar, his knees hitting the wooden steps with a bone-jarring thud. He reached out his trembling hands, clutching at the hem of my dirt-stained maid uniform, his forehead pressing against the toes of my cheap black shoes. The once proud prince of the Hamptons was now a shriveled, sobbing heap of broken ego and ruined silk. "Andrea, please!" Grant wailed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical shriek that echoed through the silent, horrified crowd. "You cannot do this. We are family. We shared a home for 28 years. Think of all the Christmases, all the birthdays. I am your brother. I have always been your brother. You can hate me. You can take the money, but please do not throw me out like this. Just give me one chance to make it right." I looked down at the back of his head, watching the way his shoulders heaved with ragged, shallow breaths. For a fleeting second, the muscle memory of 28 years of conditioning tried to surface. The urge to comfort him, to fix his mess, to sacrifice myself so he could remain shining. But that version of Andrea had been murdered in the wine cellar the night before. I felt nothing but a cold clinical curiosity, as if I were watching a parasite struggle under a microscope. 28 years, Grant." I asked, my voice cutting through his sobbing like an icy blade. My tone was devoid of anger, which seemed to terrify him more than a scream would have. "You spent those 28 years watching me eat scraps while you feasted on steak paid for with my own ransom money. You watched Howard and Lydia beat me for your mistakes. You watched me drop out of the degree I loved so you could keep your gambling addiction a secret. You did not see a sister. You saw a tool. You saw a buffer between yourself and the consequences of your own pathetic life." Grant looked up at me, his face a grotesque mask of tears, snot, and dirt. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, searching mine for even a microscopic spark of the sibling loyalty he had spent his life exploiting. "But Andrea, I love you," he stammered, his grip on my uniform tightening. "We are blood." "You are not my blood, Grant," I replied, prying his fingers off my skirt with a slow, deliberate force that made him flinch. "You are the son of kidnappers. You are the product of a 30-year crime against my father. And as for love, you were ready to sell me to a 60-year-old predator in Macau for $2 million less than 12 hours ago. You had the commitment papers ready to lock me in a padded cell for eternity. Do not ever use the word love in my presence again." Grant fell back, his face paling to a sickly, translucent gray. He looked toward Howard and Lydia, but there was no salvation there. Federal agents were currently hauling my fake parents down the center aisle. Howard's head was bowed, his spirit completely extinguished, his body moving like a wooden marionette with its strings cut. Lydia, however, was still fighting. She was screaming obscenities at the guests, her expensive designer gown torn at the shoulder, her heels dragging across the white runner, as two agents forced her toward the waiting black SUVs. "Look at them, Grant," I said, gesturing toward the spectacle of their public disgrace. "Every elite guest in the Hamptons is recording this. Your parents are being paraded in handcuffs before the very people they bankrupt themselves to impress. This is the Garrison legacy you were so eager to steal. This is the truth of your family. The hundreds of high society guests, The billionaires, the CEOs, and the socialites were all standing now, their smartphones held high like digital torches. The flashes of their cameras illuminated the carnage of the family's reputation. These were the people Grant had spent his life trying to emulate, and now they were his executioners, capturing his total annihilation for the world to see on the evening news. I turned my gaze to Lawrence Garrison, my real father. He stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, his face a mask of iron-hard resolve. He didn't need to say a word. The power radiating from him was absolute. He had spent 32 years waiting for this moment of justice, and he was savoring every second of the silence. I looked back at Grant and gave a short, sharp nod to Bennett. The security director didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and grabbed Grant by the scruff of his tuxedo collar, hoisting him into the air as if he weighed nothing. "No, Andrea." "Please," Grant screamed, his legs kicking uselessly as he was dragged away from the altar. "I have nowhere to go. I have no money. Please." I did not follow him with my eyes. I stood perfectly still on the altar, the morning sun finally warming my face. I listened to the sound of his fading screams as he was dragged down the long, rose-lined aisle. I listened to the rhythmic thud of the SUV doors slamming shut as Howard and Lydia were sealed into their new reality. Bennett and his team marched Grant all the way through the grand foyer, past the shattered remains of the crystal wine glasses, and out through the massive front entrance of the estate. They didn't stop until they reached the heavy wrought iron perimeter gates. With a coordinated heave, they tossed him out onto the dusty asphalt of the public road. Grant hit the ground hard, the fabric of his custom tuxedo trousers ripping as he skidded across the gravel. The heavy iron gates, embossed with the family crest he had tried so hard to claim, swung shut with a definitive booming metallic clang. The electronic locks engaged a sound that signaled the permanent end of his life of privilege. He scrambled to his feet, throwing himself against the bars, his hands reaching through the iron. "Let me in!" he shrieked at the guards. "This is my house, I live here." The guards didn't even look at him. They stood like statues, their backs to him, eyes scanning the horizon. Grant was now just another stranger on the street, a bankrupt homeless fraud with nothing but the dirty clothes on his back and the looming shadow of a federal investigation. Back on the lawn, the silence was finally broken by a single slow clap from the back row. It was followed by another, then another, until the entire assembly of guests was standing in a stunned, respectful ovation. They weren't cheering for the drama. They were acknowledging the rise of the true Garrison heir. I looked down at my hands. They were still covered in dust and dried wine, the bandage on my palm stained with a small circle of blood. I wasn't the broken servant anymore. I wasn't the invisible maid. I was the owner of the ground beneath my feet and the architect of my own destiny. The prince was in the gutter, and for the first time in 34 years, I was finally home. The ovation from the crowd faded into a dull, respectful murmur as Lawrence Garrison stepped onto the wooden platform of the altar. He did not care about the hundreds of elite guests watching us. He did not care about the shattered floral arrangements or the dirt tracking across the white carpet runner. He only cared about the woman standing in front of him. For a long moment, my father just looked at me. His dark eyes mapped every contour of my face, tracing the lineage he had been violently denied for 3 decades. I saw the ghost of the terrified young father. He must have been merging seamlessly with the ruthless titan he had become. Slowly, he extended his hand. It was a massive, weathered hand bearing the weight of $1 billion empire. I looked down at my own hand, still wrapped in the crude, blood-stained napkin. I did not hesitate. I placed my palm against his, our fingers interlacing with a grip that felt like solid steel. It was the first time in my life I held the hand of someone who actually would kill to protect me. "Come on," Andrea, Lawrence said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that vibrated right through to my bones. "Let us go home." I stepped down from the altar, my cheap catering shoes crunching over the ruined petals of Felicity's discarded bouquet. Bennett and the private security contractors formed a protective phalanx around us, carving a wide path through the stunned guests. The high society elite parted like the Red Sea, lowering their heads in absolute deference to the true Garrison heir. We walked across the manicured lawn, leaving the shattered illusion of Grant's wedding behind us. The air smelled of expensive catering and salt water, a sharp contrast to the damp, suffocating darkness of the wine cellar where I had spent the night. I did not look back at the mansion doors. My gaze remained fixed entirely on the horizon. The sleek black private helicopter waited for us on the south helipad, its rotors already spinning up, slicing through the ocean breeze with a deafening, rhythmic thud. Bennett opened the heavy side door, offering a brief, respectful nod as I stepped up into the luxurious leather interior. Lawrence climbed in right behind me, taking the seat opposite mine. He fastened his harness, keeping his eyes locked on me as if terrified I might vanish into thin air if he blinked. The pilot received the clearance signal from Bennett, and the heavy aircraft lifted smoothly off the ground. My stomach dropped slightly as the laws of physics yielded to the raw power of the engine. I leaned toward the reinforced window, looking down at the sprawling multi-million-dollar Hamptons estate as we rapidly gained altitude. From 1,000 feet in the air, the mansion looked like an elaborate dollhouse. I could see the pristine tennis courts, the massive infinity pool, and the winding driveway where federal agents had just hauled away my captors. I watched the tiny figure of Grant, pacing furiously outside the wrought iron gates, completely locked out of the kingdom he thought he owned. A profound bone-deep satisfaction washed over me. I had not just escaped that house of horrors, I had conquered it. The title deed to that estate rested securely in my holding company's portfolio. Every brick, every blade of grass, and every drop of water in that pool legally belonged to the servant they had tortured. I owned their sanctuary. I had bought their sanctuary out from under them while they slept, turning their fortress into my personal trophy. As the helicopter banked sharply toward the glittering skyline of Manhattan, Lawrence reached across the cabin and tapped the secure communications console on the table between us. "I have a team of the best doctors in the city waiting for our arrival," Lawrence stated, his tone shifting back to the commanding executive. "We are going to get those bruises looked at. We are going to get you a proper meal, clean clothes, and a safe place to sleep. And then we are going to talk about your future." I looked away from this window, meeting his intense gaze. "My future is already secured," I replied calmly. "Silas transferred the remaining liquid assets from my private accounts into the new trust this morning. But I am not going to sit in a penthouse and simply manage an investment portfolio. I have a different operation in mind." Lawrence leaned back in his leather seat, crossing his arms with a look of immense pride. "Tell me what you need," he said simply. "I need to build a foundation." I explained the vision crystallizing in my mind with absolute clarity. A highly aggressive, fiercely funded legal and investigative foundation. There are thousands of children trapped behind the closed doors of wealthy, respectable families. Children who are used as props. Children who are exploited for financial gain. Children who are abused by the very people the world views as upstanding citizens. I know exactly how these monsters operate because I was raised by them. I know how they hide the bruises, how they manipulate the legal system, and how they use their money to silence the victims. My foundation is going to hunt them down. I continued, my voice steady and cold. "We will deploy the best private investigators, the most ruthless litigators, and the sharpest forensic accountants in the country. We will dismantle their fraudulent lives brick by brick, just like I did to Howard and Lydia today. I am going to make sure no child ever has to scrub a floor for their kidnappers again." Lawrence smiled, a slow, dangerous expression that perfectly mirrored the lethal determination in my own heart. "Consider it fully funded," he agreed without a second of hesitation. "You are going to be a terrifying force in this world, Andrea." I rested my head against the cool glass of the window, watching the magnificent steel towers of the city rising up to meet us. The physical wounds would heal. The memories of the dark wine cellar and the scratchy gray maid uniform would eventually fade. But the strength I forged in that darkness would remain indestructible. Society teaches us that the highest moral ground is to turn the other cheek, to forgive those who trespass against us, and to walk away in peace. That is a lie invented to protect the guilty. True justice is rarely peaceful. It requires a heavy, unrelenting hand. The absolute sweetest revenge is not forgiveness. The sweetest revenge is ripping away the very foundation of their arrogance. It is looking them in the eye as you strip them of everything they were proud of, tossing them out into the cold, and leaving them to rot entirely in the ashes of their own toxic ambition. Society often dictates that we must endlessly forgive our abusers to find inner peace, especially when those abusers are disguised as family. However, the story of Andrea teaches us a radically different and deeply empowering lesson. True healing does not always require turning the other cheek or quietly walking away. Sometimes the most profound act of self-love is holding toxic individuals absolutely accountable for their actions and reclaiming what they tried to steal from you. For nearly 3 decades, her captors controlled her reality by diminishing her self-worth, exploiting her labor, and hiding her true identity. Andrea's ultimate triumph was not merely regaining her stolen financial assets or discovering her rightful name as a billionaire's heiress. It was meticulously dismantling the very foundation of arrogance that her abusers built their fake empire upon. By utilizing her intellect, extreme patience, and strategic foresight, she transformed her deep lingering trauma into an impenetrable armor. She realized that her inherent value was never defined by the monsters who tried to break her spirit in the dark. Furthermore, Andrea's decision to channel her reclaimed wealth and freedom into a foundation protecting other exploited children highlights the ultimate purpose of surviving such severe trauma. The sweetest victory is not just personal vindication, but using the power you boldly took back to ensure no one else has to suffer the same fate. It is about breaking the cycle of abuse permanently and replacing a legacy of cruelty with one of fierce protective justice. If you ever find yourself trapped in a toxic environment that diminishes your light, remember your absolute worth, document your truth, and take the courageous steps today to reclaim your power and build the life you truly deserve.